Welcome back to another episode of Lazy History, where we uncover the brutal truths behind the romanticized tales of medieval times. Today, we're not stepping into the halls of noble knights or the chambers of righteous kings. No, we're diving headfirst into one of history's most shocking betrayals, a story of greed, desperation, and political manipulation that would make modern corrupt politicians blush with embarrassment. We're here to talk about how the most powerful military and financial organization in medieval Europe, an order so wealthy they could loan money to kings so influential they answered only to the Pope himself, was completely destroyed in a single day by the very people they had served and protected for centuries. This isn't a story about battlefield defeats or noble sacrifices. This is a story about how one king's mounting debts led to torture chambers, false confessions, and the complete annihilation of the Knights Templar. So settle in as we explore the dark, twisted, and utterly ruthless world of medieval politics, where owing money to the wrong people could literally get you burned alive, and where the phrase Friday the 13th was born from one of history's most coordinated acts of royal treachery. The rise of the medieval banking empire. Let's start with something that might surprise you. The Knights Templar weren't just medieval warriors swinging swords and wearing white cloaks with red crosses. By the early 1300s, they had become something far more powerful and far more dangerous to the established order. They had become the world's first international banking system. Think about this for a moment. In 1150, the Templars began issuing something that would sound familiar to anyone with a modern bank account: letters of credit. A pilgrim could walk into a Templar house in Paris, deposit their gold, receive a piece of paper, and then withdraw that same amount of money from a Templar house in Jerusalem. This was revolutionary technology in an age when transporting large amounts of money across hundreds of miles meant risking robbery, murder, and complete financial ruin. But the Templars didn't stop at simple money transfers. They became full-service bankers, offering loans, managing estates, and providing financial advice to everyone from wealthy merchants to kings themselves. When Pope Alexander Roman III needed money between 1159 and 1181, he didn't go to Italian moneylenders or Jewish financiers, he went to the Knights Templar. When Pope Innocent Roman III decided to tax the clergy to fund the Crusades in 1198, he didn't trust the church hierarchy to collect and transport the money, he gave the job to the Templars. The scale of their operations was absolutely staggering. The Templars maintained major financial centers in Paris, London, and across the Mediterranean. They had their own treasury, their own accounting systems, and their own methods of moving vast sums of money across Europe and the Middle East without losing a single coin to bandits or corrupt officials. Medieval people trusted the Templars with their wealth because, unlike secular merchants or royal officials, the Templars were bound by religious vows and protected by the church. Their reputation for trustworthiness wasn't just about religious devotion, it was about results. The Templars had developed what we would recognize today as modern banking practices. They kept extensive records of all financial transactions, they had standardized procedures for deposits and withdrawals, and they had developed sophisticated methods for verifying the authenticity of their letters of credit. When you did business with the Templars, you weren't just trusting in their religious vows, you were trusting in a financial system that actually worked. But here's where things get interesting and dangerous. The Templars' success as bankers had made them incredibly wealthy, but it had also made them incredibly independent. Unlike other religious orders that depended on donations and the goodwill of secular rulers, the Templars had their own income, their own resources, and their own agenda. They answered to the Pope, not to kings, and they had the financial power to back up that independence. By 1300, the Templars controlled wealth that dwarfed the treasuries of most European kingdoms. They owned thousands of properties, they held debts from nobles and royalty across Europe, and they had accumulated vast stores of gold, silver, and precious stones from their banking operations. Most importantly, they had learned that money, properly managed, could be more powerful than swords, and this lesson was about to put them in direct conflict with a king who desperately needed both their money and their destruction. The Templars' banking operations were just the visible tip of an enormous economic iceberg. Beneath their financial services lay a vast network of agricultural estates, industrial operations, and commercial enterprises that generated steady income across Europe. The Templars weren't just lending money, they were actively producing wealth through farming, manufacturing, and trade. Their commanderies operated as integrated economic units, combining agriculture, livestock, wine production, and even mining in some regions. The Templar Empire, more than just warrior monks, To understand how completely Philip Roman IV destroyed the Templars, you need to understand just how massive their organization had become by 1307. The Knights Templar weren't just a religious order with some military capabilities, they were a multinational corporation with their own private army, their own diplomatic service, and their own sovereign territory. The organizational structure of the Templars was incredibly sophisticated for a medieval institution. At the top sat the Grand Master, who held absolute authority over the entire order and was elected for life by the other senior officers. Below him were regional masters who controlled Templar operations in major territories like France, England, Spain, Portugal, and the Holy Land. Each regional master supervised dozens of local commanders who managed individual commanderies, the basic administrative and economic units of the Templar system. The numbers involved were staggering. At its peak, the Templar Order included between 15,000 and 20,000 members, of whom only about 10% were actual knights. The rest were sergeants, chaplains, craftsmen, and support personnel who kept the vast Templar machine functioning. But even more impressive than the number of people was the extent of their property holdings. The Templars controlled approximately 1,000 commanderies across Western Europe, each of which was the center of a substantial rural state. These commanderies weren't simple monasteries or military outposts. They were integrated economic enterprises that included residential quarters for the Templars, workshops for craftsmen, stables for horses, granaries for storing grain, mills for processing flour, presses for making wine, and administrative buildings for managing the complex paperwork required to coordinate operations across such a vast network. Some commanderies controlled territories spanning hundreds of square miles and included multiple villages whose inhabitants worked Templar land and paid rent to Templar landlords. The Paris Temple, the Order's headquarters in France, was particularly impressive. This massive complex covered several acres in the heart of Paris and was surrounded by walls that were 10 meters high and reinforced with towers and buttresses. Inside these walls were not just residential quarters for the Templars, but also a treasury that rivaled the royal treasury, stables that could house hundreds of horses, workshops where craftsmen produced everything from weapons to religious artifacts, and administrative offices where clerks maintained the financial records that tracked Templar operations across Europe. The military organization of the Templars was equally impressive. While only about 1,500 to 2,000 of the Templars were actual knights, these were among the best trained and best equipped warriors in medieval Europe. Templar knights underwent years of training in horsemanship, swordsmanship, and battlefield tactics. They were supported by sergeants who served as lighter cavalry and infantry, and by a complex logistics system that could maintain and supply Templar forces across vast distances. But the Templars' real military strength lay not in their individual prowess, but in their organizational capabilities. Unlike feudal armies that were assembled for specific campaigns and then disbanded, the Templars maintained a permanent military force that was always ready for action. Their commanderies served as recruitment centers, training facilities, and supplied depots that could mobilize resources quickly and efficiently. When the Templars went to war, they brought not just skilled fighters, but also the logistical support necessary to sustain military operations over extended periods. The Templars also possessed something that no secular ruler could match: complete international mobility. Because they answered only to the Pope, Templar knights and officials could travel freely across national boundaries without interference from local authorities. This gave them enormous advantages in both military and commercial operations, allowing them to coordinate activities across the entire European continent in ways that would have been impossible for any secular organization. Perhaps most importantly, the Templars had achieved something that even kings envied: complete financial independence. Their vast network of commanderies generated steady income through agricultural production, rent collection, and commercial activities. Their banking operations provided additional revenue through interest on loans and fees for financial services. Unlike secular rulers who depended on taxation and plunder for revenue, the Templars had created a self-sustaining economic system that grew stronger over time rather than weaker. Philip V, the king who spent what he didn't have, Philip Roman IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, was exactly the kind of ruler who gives absolute monarchy a bad name. Handsome, arrogant, and completely convinced of his own divine right to rule, Philip had one major problem that would define his entire reign and ultimately lead to one of the most shocking betrayals in medieval history. He spent money like it was going out of style, and he had no realistic way to pay for his extravagant lifestyle and constant wars. When Philip inherited the throne from his father in 1285, he also inherited something else: massive debts. The previous king's conflict with Aragon had cost the French treasury enormous sums, and by November 1286, Philip owed 8 tons of silver to his primary creditors, the Knights Templar. To put this in perspective, 8 tons of silver represented about 17% of the entire French government's annual revenue, which totaled approximately 860,000 livres tournois, equivalent to 46 tons of silver. Imagine if the United States government owed 17% of its annual budget to a single organization that operated independently and answered to no American authority. That's essentially the situation Philip found himself in. Initially, Philip managed to pay off this debt, and for a few years in the late 1280s, France actually ran a budget surplus. But Philip had expensive tastes and even more expensive political ambitions that would soon plunge France into financial crisis. The scale of Philip's financial responsibility becomes clear when you look at the actual numbers. The war against Aragon, inherited from Philip's father, required the expenditure of 1.5 million livres tournois. Philip's decision to go to war with England over Gascony between 1294 and 1299 cost another 1.73 million livres tournois. These weren't small expenses, these were kingdom-bankrupting amounts of money that represented multiple years of the entire French government's revenue. But Philip wasn't content to fight just one war at a time. In 1297, the county of Flanders declared independence from France, opening up yet another expensive military front. Philip was now fighting wars on multiple fronts, maintaining a lavish royal court, and trying to build monuments to his own glory, all while operating with a medieval taxation system that couldn't possibly generate enough revenue to cover these expenses. The French royal taxation system in the early 1300s was primitive compared to modern standards, but it was actually quite sophisticated for its time. Philip could collect regular revenues from the royal demesne, which consisted of lands directly owned by the crown and generated about 30% of total royal income. He could also impose various taxes on his subjects, including the taille, which was levied on the citizens of Paris and other major cities. But even these sources of income were insufficient to cover Philip's extraordinary military expenses. As the debts mounted, Philip began to take increasingly desperate measures to raise money. He ordered the arrest of Lombard merchants who had made him loans, seized their assets, and then forced them to pay 250,000 livres tournois for the privilege of becoming French citizens. This wasn't taxation, this was legalized robbery, but it still wasn't enough to solve Philip's fundamental problem. By 1295, Philip had accumulated so much debt to the Templars that he was forced to find new creditors. He turned to the Florentine Franciscan bankers, who could raise larger loans than the Templars, but this decision created a new problem. Philip now owed money to multiple powerful organizations, and he was rapidly reaching the point where his debt payments were consuming a significant portion of his government's entire budget. The situation became so dire that Philip resorted to one of the oldest and most destructive tricks in the royal playbook: currency debasement. Between November 1296 and Christmas 1299, Philip systematically reduced the silver content of French coins, effectively stealing wealth from everyone who held French currency. This desperate measure provided Philip with 1.419 million livres parisis, which was enough to cover his immediate war costs, but it also created massive inflation and social unrest throughout France. The economic consequences of Philip's financial mismanagement were devastating. By August 1303, French currency had lost 2/3 of its value. The defeat at the Battle of Golden Spurs in 1302 triggered a 37% depreciation of the currency in just 15 months. Philip was forced to order officials and subjects to hand over their silver vessels for melting into coins, and he banned the export of gold and silver to prevent people from moving their wealth out of the country. But here's the crucial point: even as Philip was destroying his kingdom's economy through currency manipulation and crushing taxation, he still owed enormous sums to the Knights Templar. The Templars weren't just creditors, they were powerful, independent creditors who had the resources and the connections to cause serious political problems for a king who couldn't pay his debts. Philip needed a solution that would not only eliminate his debts to the Templars, but would also provide him with enough new wealth to solve his financial crisis permanently. The perfect target why the Templars had it coming. By 1307, the Knights Templar had unwittingly made themselves the perfect target for a desperate king looking to solve his financial problems through violence and theft. They had everything Philip needed: vast wealth, political vulnerability, and most importantly, a changing reputation that would make their destruction politically feasible. First, let's talk about their wealth, because the Templars' accumulated riches were absolutely staggering by medieval standards. After nearly 2 centuries of banking operations, property accumulation, and donations from wealthy nobles seeking salvation, the Templars controlled assets that rivaled the treasures of major European kingdoms. They owned thousands of properties across France alone, from massive castle complexes to urban real estate in major cities. Their Paris temple wasn't just a fortress, it was essentially the Federal Reserve of medieval Europe, containing vast stores of gold, silver, precious stones, and most importantly, detailed financial records showing exactly who owed money to whom. But the Templars' wealth wasn't just sitting in vaults gathering dust. They were active investors and property managers, generating steady income from their real estate holdings, their banking operations, and their agricultural estates. Unlike the wealth of kings, which depended on taxation and plunder, the Templars' wealth was self-sustaining and constantly growing. This made them incredibly powerful, but it also made them incredibly tempting to anyone who could figure out a way to steal everything they owned. The commandery system that the Templars had developed was particularly vulnerable to coordinated attack. Each commandery operated as an integrated economic unit, managing vast rural estates that included farmland, livestock, mills, workshops, and entire villages. These commanderies were designed to be largely self-sufficient, but they were also isolated and often defended by only a handful of Templars and their servants. A well-coordinated surprise attack could capture dozens of commanderies simultaneously, seizing their assets before the Templars could mount any kind of organized defense. The second factor that made the Templars vulnerable was their changing political situation. The loss of the Holy Land to Muslim forces in 1291 had left the Templars without their primary mission. For nearly 2 centuries, the Templars had justified their wealth, their independence, and their special privileges by pointing to their role in protecting Christian interests in the Holy Land. But with Jerusalem lost and no realistic prospect of reconquest, people were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about why the Templars still needed to exist as an independent military order. This crisis of purpose created public relations problems that Philip's advisors were quick to exploit. If the Templars were no longer fighting infidels in the Holy Land, why were they still collecting donations from Christians across Europe? If they weren't actively engaged in crusading, why did they need to maintain their vast military infrastructure and their exemptions from royal authority? These questions didn't have good answers, and the Templars' attempts to adapt by focusing more on their banking and administrative roles only made them seem more like a business enterprise and less like a holy order. The third factor was the changing balance of power between secular and religious authority in early 14th century Europe. The fierce conflict between Philip Roman IV and Pope Boniface Roman VIII had ended with the Pope's death in 1303, and the election of Clement V as the new Pope had fundamentally altered the political landscape. Clement V was French. He was politically dependent on French support, and most importantly, he had moved the papal court from Rome to Avignon, placing it firmly within the sphere of French influence. For the first time in their history, the Templars could not count on absolute papal protection. Previous popes had been willing to defend the Templars against secular rulers because the order served papal interests and represented papal authority. But Clement V was in no position to challenge Philip Roman IV over the fate of the Templars, especially if Philip could provide convincing evidence of wrongdoing that would justify the order's destruction. The fourth factor was the Templars' own organizational culture, which had made them powerful but had also made them complacent and vulnerable. The Templars were used to being untouchable. For 2 centuries, they had operated with virtual impunity, protected by papal authority and feared for their military prowess. This success had bred a dangerous overconfidence that left them unprepared for the kind of coordinated political attack that Philip was planning. The Templar secrecy, which had once been their strength, had become a liability in a changed political environment of the early 1300s. Their private meetings, their secret initiation ceremonies, and their confidential financial dealings had always generated curiosity and suspicion, but these had been manageable as long as the Templars had powerful protectors. Now, with papal protection uncertain and public opinion shifting, the Templar secretive culture provided perfect material for anyone wanting to fabricate accusations of heresy and corruption. Finally, the Templars made themselves vulnerable through their very success as financiers. By becoming the creditors of kings and nobles across Europe, they had made themselves essential to the medieval economy, but they had also made themselves targets for anyone who preferred theft or repayment. Philip Roman IV wasn't the first ruler to consider destroying his creditors rather than paying his debts, but he was in a unique position to actually carry out such a plan successfully. Guillaume de Nogaret, the architect of destruction. Behind every great act of political evil, there's usually a brilliant and completely immoral advisor who figured out how to make it work, and Philip Roman IV had exactly that kind of man in Guillaume de Nogaret. Nogaret was Philip's chief minister, legal advisor, and professional destroyer of inconvenient enemies, and he was about to orchestrate one of the most sophisticated character assassination campaigns in medieval history. Nogaret understood that Philip couldn't simply arrest the Templars and steal their wealth without providing some kind of legal and moral justification that would satisfy both the French nobility and the international community. Medieval politics, despite their brutality, still operated within certain rules and conventions, and even kings couldn't just openly rob and murder religious orders without facing serious political consequences. The solution Nogaret developed was brilliant in its cynicism and effectiveness. Rather than accusing the Templars of financial crimes, which would be difficult for the general public to understand and might generate sympathy for the order, Nogaret decided to accuse them of religious crimes that would horrify medieval Christian society and make it impossible for anyone to defend them. The specific charges Nogaret compiled were designed to be as shocking and disgusting as possible. The Templars were accused of denying Christ during their secret initiation ceremonies, of spitting on the cross, of worshipping idols, of engaging in homosexual practices, and of various other forms of heresy and blasphemy. These accusations were almost certainly fabricated, but they were exactly the kind of charges that would inflame popular opinion and provide moral justification for the complete destruction of the order. Nogaret spent months carefully building his case, collecting testimonies from disgruntled former Templars, fabricating evidence, and developing a comprehensive propaganda campaign designed to convince both the French people and the international community that the Templars were not holy warriors but dangerous heretics who threatened the very foundations of Christian society. The legal framework Nogaret created was particularly sophisticated. He couldn't simply have Philip declare the Templars guilty of heresy, because that would exceed royal authority and might provoke a direct confrontation with the Pope. Instead, Nogaret arranged for the accusations to come from multiple sources, including anonymous informants, former Templars, and concerned clergy, creating the appearance of a grassroots movement demanding investigation of Templar crimes. Nogaret also understood the crucial importance of timing and coordination. If the Templars were warned about the coming arrests, they could use their wealth and international connections to escape or fight back. The plan had to be executed simultaneously across all of France, with such speed and precision that the Templars would be captured before they could mount any kind of defense or appeal for outside help. The propaganda campaign Nogaret orchestrated was remarkably modern in its sophistication. He didn't just spread accusations against the Templars, he created a complete narrative that explained why these accusations were credible and why immediate action was necessary. According to Nogaret's version of events, the Templars had been corrupted by their contact with Muslim and Eastern Christian heretics during their time in the Holy Land. Their wealth and independence had allowed this corruption to flourish, and their secrecy had prevented Orthodox Christians from discovering and correcting these dangerous deviations from proper Christian doctrine. This narrative was particularly effective because it incorporated several elements that would resonate with medieval audiences. First, it played on existing suspicions about the Templar secrecy and independence. Second, it provided an explanation for how good Christians could have become heretics that didn't require anyone to admit that the Church had been supporting and protecting heretics for centuries. Third, it suggested that the Templars' wealth and power, rather than being signs of God's favor, were actually evidence of their corruption and alliance with evil forces. Nogaret's masterstroke was his decision to present Philip not as a greedy king looking to steal the Templars' wealth, but as a reluctant warrior for Christ who had discovered horrible truths about an order he had trusted and was now compelled by his duty to God and to France to take action against heretics and blasphemers. This framing was crucial because it allowed Philip to appear righteous rather than avaricious, and it provided moral justification for what was essentially the largest organized robbery in medieval European history. The Templars' fatal overconfidence. As Guillaume de Nogaret spent months preparing his elaborate trap, the Knights Templar continued their daily routines with absolutely no idea that their entire world was about to collapse. Their very success had bred a dangerous complacency that would prove fatal when Philip finally struck. Jacques de Molay, the 73-year-old Grand Master of the Knights Templar, was in Paris during the early months of 1307, conducting routine business and maintaining the political relationships that had kept the order powerful for so long. Molay had been Grand Master since around 1298, and he had spent decades managing the order's transition from its original crusading mission to its new role as Europe's premier financial institution. He was an experienced administrator and a skilled diplomat, but he had no experience dealing with the kind of existential threat that Philip and Norgard were preparing. The tragic irony of the situation was that Molay had actually requested papal investigation of some of the accusations that were circulating about the Templars. Rather than recognizing these accusations as signs of a coordinated attack, Molay seems to have believed that a formal papal investigation would clear the order's name and put an end to the rumors. This decision demonstrates just how completely the Templars misunderstood the political situation they were facing. Molay's confidence in papal protection was understandable but ultimately misplaced. For 2 centuries, the Templars had been able to rely on papal authority to shield them from secular interference. When kings or nobles had tried to challenge Templar independence in the past, the popes had consistently supported the order and forced secular rulers to back down. But Molay failed to recognize that the political balance between secular and religious authority had fundamentally shifted with the election of Clement V and the move of the papal court to Avignon. The Templars' daily routine in Paris during 1307 would have seemed completely normal to anyone observing from the outside. They attended their religious services, managed their financial affairs, maintained their properties, and continued their secretive meetings and ceremonies. Their very success had made them complacent. They had been untouchable for so long that they couldn't imagine anyone being bold enough to challenge them directly. In the Paris Temple, the massive Templar complex that served as their headquarters in France, normal business continued right up until the moment of their arrest. The temple wasn't just a building, it was a symbol of Templar power and independence, with its high walls, its treasury, and its private chapels representing everything that made the Templars seem like a separate nation within France. Soon, those same walls that had protected the Templars would become the walls of their prison. Meanwhile, across France, Templars at smaller houses and properties continued their daily routines without any sense of impending doom. The order's decentralized structure, which had been one of its strengths during the crusading era, would prove to be a fatal weakness when faced with a coordinated surprise attack. Unlike a conventional army that could be warned and mobilized quickly, the Templars were scattered across hundreds of locations, each of which would have to be captured individually to prevent the order from regrouping and mounting a defense. The Templars' faith in their own invulnerability was perhaps their greatest weakness. They had spent so long being the most powerful non-royal organization in Europe that they had forgotten how quickly political situations could change. They had become bureaucrats and bankers rather than warriors, and they had lost the paranoid vigilance that had once made them so formidable. The secret orders planning the perfect crime. On September 14th, 1307, sealed orders bearing the royal seal of Philip Roman IV went out to every bailiff and seneschal in the Kingdom of France. These orders contained instructions for what would become one of the most ambitious and coordinated police operations in medieval history, the simultaneous arrest of every Knight Templar in France. The secrecy surrounding these orders was absolutely crucial to the success of Philip's plan. The bailiffs and seneschals were instructed not to open their orders until the appointed date, and they were warned that breaking the secrecy would be considered treason against the crown. Philip understood that if word of the planned arrest leaked to the Templars, the entire operation would fail catastrophically. The logistical challenges of coordinating simultaneous arrests across the entire Kingdom of France were enormous. France in 1307 was a vast territory covering more than 40,000 square miles, with limited communication systems and primitive transportation networks. Medieval kings didn't have telephones, radios, or rapid transportation, which meant that coordinating the timing of operations across such a large area required months of careful planning and preparation. Yet Philip's administration managed to coordinate the timing so precisely that Templars throughout the kingdom would be arrested at dawn on the same day, giving them no opportunity to warn each other or escape. This level of coordination required not just careful planning, but also the complete loyalty and competence of hundreds of royal officials across France. The personal letters from Philip that accompanied the sealed orders were masterpieces of propaganda and emotional manipulation. The king presented himself as a reluctant warrior for Christ, heartbroken at having to take action against an order he had trusted, but compelled by his duty to God and to France to act against heretics and blasphemers. Philip claimed that the evidence against the Templars was so overwhelming and so horrifying that he had no choice but to act immediately to protect Christian society. These letters served multiple purposes beyond just providing justification for the arrests. First, they ensured that Philip's agents would approach their task with righteous enthusiasm rather than reluctance or doubt. Royal officials who believed they were carrying out a holy mission would be more likely to execute their orders efficiently and brutally. Second, the letters created a paper trail that could be used to justify the arrests to other European rulers and to the Pope himself. The orders specified that every Templar found in France was to be arrested, from Grand Master Jacques de Molay himself down to the lowest serving brother. All Templar property was to be seized immediately, all Templar records were to be confiscated, and all Templar gold and silver was to be secured for the royal treasury. This wasn't just an arrest operation, it was a complete liquidation of an entire organization. The instructions also included detailed procedures for securing Templar properties and preventing the destruction of evidence. Philip's agents were told to take immediate control of all Templar buildings, to place guards on all Templar treasuries, and to prevent any Templar from destroying documents or hiding assets. The king understood that the success of his plan depended not just on capturing the Templars themselves, but on seizing all of their wealth and all of the records that would prove who owed money to the order. Perhaps most importantly, the orders included specific instructions for dealing with resistance. The Templars weren't helpless victims. They were trained warriors who could be expected to fight back if given the chance. Philip's agents were authorized to use whatever force was necessary to complete their mission, and they were provided with sufficient armed support to overwhelm any individual Templar house. The calm before the storm. As October 1307 began, the Knights Templar continued their daily routines in complete ignorance of the catastrophe that was about to befall them. The contrast between their sense of security and the reality of their situation would be almost comical if the consequences weren't so tragic. Jacques de Molay was staying at the Paris Temple, conducting business and preparing for what he believed would be discussions about organizing a new crusade. Pope Clement V had summoned Molay to France ostensibly to discuss the possibility of launching another expedition to reclaim the Holy Land, and Molay seems to have genuinely believed that this represented an opportunity to restore the Templars' original mission and purpose. The irony of Molay's situation was particularly cruel. He had come to France voluntarily, responding to what he believed was a papal request for consultation about crusading strategy. In reality, he had walked directly into a trap that had been months in the making, and his presence in Paris would make it impossible for him to escape when the arrests began. The Paris Temple itself was a monument to Templar power and success. The massive complex included not just residential quarters for the Templars, but also a treasury, a chapel, administrative offices, and quarters for visitors and guests. The temple's high walls and defensive structures had been built to protect the Templars and their wealth from external threats, but soon those same walls would become prison walls, trapping the Templars inside with their captors. Meanwhile, across France, hundreds of other Templars went about their normal business, managing properties, conducting financial transactions, and maintaining the vast infrastructure that made their organization so powerful. Templar houses in major cities like Lyon, Marseille, and Toulouse continued their operations without any sense that these would be their final days of freedom. The tragic aspect of this situation was that many of the Templars were genuinely holy men who had devoted their lives to serving God and protecting Christian interests. Whatever corruption may have existed within the order, and the evidence suggests that most of the accusations against them were fabricated, the majority of Templars were sincere in their religious devotion and their commitment to their vows. Royal agents across France spent these final days making their last preparations. Weapons were distributed, arrest warrants were prepared, and local authorities were briefed on their specific targets and objectives. The operation required careful coordination because the Templars weren't helpless victims. They were trained warriors with significant resources and the potential to mount effective resistance if they were given any warning. Philip himself spent these crucial days carefully managing his public image and his political relationships. He needed to ensure that when the arrests were made, he would be seen as a righteous king protecting Christianity rather than a desperate ruler robbing his creditors. The propaganda campaign that Guillaume de Nogaret had been building for months was about to reach its climax, and every aspect of Philip's public presentation had to support the narrative that the Templars were dangerous heretics who threatened the very foundations of Christian society. As the night of October 12th gave way to the dawn of October 13th, hundreds of royal agents across France prepared to execute the orders they had carried in secret for nearly a month. In a few hours, the most powerful military and financial organization in medieval Europe would cease to exist, and Friday the 13th would become forever associated with sudden, devastating bad luck. The Templars were about to learn the hardest lesson in medieval politics, that being right, being powerful, and being wealthy meant nothing if you didn't have the political protection to defend yourself against a desperate king who had decided that destroying you was easier than paying what he owed you. Jacques de Molay was about to begin a 7-year ordeal of imprisonment, torture, and show trials that would end with his execution and his famous curse upon the king and pope who had destroyed his order. What happened at dawn on Friday, October 13th, 1307, would shock medieval Europe and create a legend that persists to this day. The simultaneous arrest of hundreds of Templars across France was just the beginning of a story that would involve torture, false confessions, political manipulation, and ultimately a burning that would be remembered for centuries. But the dramatic dawn is where our story truly begins, and in the next part we'll witness the execution of one of the most coordinated and devastating surprise attacks in medieval history, as King Philip's desperate gamble to solve his financial problems destroys the lives of hundreds of innocent men and changes the course of European history forever. The perfect storm breaks. As the first grey light of dawn crept across the French countryside on Friday, October 13th, 1307, hundreds of royal agents across the Kingdom of France simultaneously broke the wax seals on orders they had carried in secret for nearly a month. In cities, towns, and rural commanderies from Normandy to Provence, from Brittany to Burgundy, the most coordinated police operation in medieval history was about to begin. The timing was absolutely crucial, and Philip Roman IV's administration had planned it with military precision. The arrests had to happen simultaneously across the entire kingdom to prevent any Templar from warning the others or organizing resistance. Medieval communication systems were primitive, but they were fast enough that a single escaped Templar could potentially ride ahead of the arrest teams and alert other commanderies. Philip's entire plan depended on speed, surprise, and overwhelming force. At exactly dawn, royal bailiffs and their armed retinues arrived at Templar houses across France and presented their warrants. The language of these warrants was deliberately inflammatory, designed to cow any potential resistance and justify the extraordinary measures that were about to unfold. Philip's orders described the Templars as guilty of a bitter thing, a lamentable thing, a thing which is horrible to contemplate, terrible to hear of, a detestable crime, an execrable evil, an abominable work, a detestable disgrace, a thing almost inhuman, indeed set apart from all humanity. This wasn't the language of law enforcement, this was the language of holy war. Philip needed his agents to believe they were confronting dangerous heretics rather than arresting respected members of a religious order. The propaganda campaign that Guillaume de Nogaret had been building for months was now paying dividends, as royal officials approached their task with the righteous enthusiasm of crusaders rather than the reluctance of men who might be making a terrible mistake. Guillaume de Nogaret himself had taken personal charge of the most important arrest of all. As keeper of the seal and Philip's most trusted advisor, Nogaret led the team that burst through the gates of the Paris temple to arrest Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master of the entire Templar order. This wasn't just symbolically important, it was strategically crucial because Molay's arrest would prevent any coordinated resistance from the Templar leadership. The shock of the arrests was absolute and devastating. The Templars had no warning, no time to prepare, and no opportunity to mount any kind of organized defense. At the Paris temple, Jacques de Molay was conducting his morning prayers when Nogaret's soldiers burst through the gates and placed him under arrest. The 73-year-old Grand Master, who had spent decades managing one of Europe's most powerful organizations, suddenly found himself chained and dragged away to prison like a common criminal. The scope of the nightmare. The geographic scale of Philip's operation was breathtaking in its ambition and precision. From the great Templar fortress at Carcassonne in the south to the commanderies of Normandy in the north, from the Atlantic ports of Brittany to the Alpine valleys of Savoy, royal agents executed their orders with remarkable coordination. This level of administrative efficiency was unprecedented in medieval Europe and demonstrated just how sophisticated Philip's government had become under Guillaume de Naugaert's direction. In the Alps Maritimes region, Templars were installed in old Roman locations including Vence, Broc, Gadières, La Garde, and Tourette-sur-Loup. The Commandeur of Saint Martin de Vence was arrested at exactly 5 a.m. on Friday the 13th by the Vigan of St. Paul, demonstrating the precise timing that had been coordinated across hundreds of miles of medieval territory. Each arrest followed the same pattern, overwhelming force applied with perfect timing to prevent any possibility of escape or resistance. The numbers involved in Philip's operation were staggering by medieval standards. Royal agents arrested approximately 2,000 Templars throughout France on that single day. This wasn't just the leadership of the order, this was virtually every Templar who could be found within the borders of the Kingdom of France, from Grand Master Jacques de Molay down to the humblest serving brother. The arrests included not only the warrior monks themselves, but also the craftsmen, administrators, chaplains, and support personnel who kept the vast Templar machine functioning. The Templars controlled a vast network of commanderies throughout France, including major centres in Normandy, Languedoc, and Brittany. These commanderies were more than simple monasteries or military outposts. They were integrated economic enterprises that included residential quarters, workshops, stables, granaries, mills, wine presses, and administrative buildings. Each commandery was the centre of a substantial rural estate that might include multiple villages whose inhabitants worked Templar land and paid rent to Templar landlords. The Temple Church in Paris, the headquarters of Templar power in France, was designed to inspire awe and demonstrate the order's wealth and influence. Its architecture was inspired by the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, reflecting the Templars' deep connection to the Holy Land. It served as the spiritual and administrative heart of the order in France, housing not only their religious ceremonies but also their vast wealth and the extensive administrative systems that managed their network of commanderies across the kingdom. But when Philip's agents reached the Paris temple and broke into the treasury that was supposed to contain the order's vast accumulated wealth, they made a shocking discovery that would fundamentally alter the course of the trials. The treasury was virtually empty. The Templars had somehow managed to move their most liquid assets before the arrests, leaving Philip with plenty of real estate and agricultural land, but without the ready cash he desperately needed to solve his immediate financial crisis. The architecture of betrayal. The arrest operation wasn't just a matter of overwhelming individual commanderies with superior force. It required a level of organizational sophistication that would have impressed modern intelligence agencies. Guillaume de Naugaert had spent months creating the infrastructure necessary to coordinate simultaneous operations across hundreds of locations, ensuring that royal agents had accurate intelligence about each Templar property, sufficient manpower to overcome any resistance, and detailed instructions about what to seize and how to secure it. Naugaert's preparation involved extensive intelligence gathering about Templar locations, personnel, and resources. Royal agents had been quietly surveying Templar properties for months, counting the number of inhabitants, assessing their defensive capabilities, and identifying the most valuable assets to be seized. This wasn't a spontaneous police action, it was a carefully planned military operation designed to achieve complete surprise and overwhelming tactical advantage. The propaganda preparation was equally sophisticated. Naugaert understood that the success of the operation depended not just on capturing the Templars, but on convincing the French people and the international community that the arrests were justified. The accusations of heresy and blasphemy had been carefully crafted to be as shocking and disgusting as possible to medieval Christian audiences, ensuring that few people would be willing to defend the Templars once the charges became public. What made the Templars especially susceptible to Philip and Naugaert's propaganda campaign was the secrecy surrounding the order. The Templars' private meetings, secret initiation ceremonies, and confidential financial dealings had always generated curiosity and suspicion among outsiders. Naugaert exploited the secrecy by suggesting that the Templars were hiding terrible crimes behind their veil of confidentiality. The legal framework that Naugaert created was particularly brilliant in its cynicism. He couldn't simply have Philip declare the Templars guilty of heresy, because that would exceed royal authority and might provoke a direct confrontation with the Pope. Instead, Naugaert arranged for the accusations to come from multiple sources, including anonymous informants, disgruntled former Templars, and concerned clergy, creating the appearance of a grassroots movement demanding investigation of Templar crimes. Individual stories of destruction. While the overall scope of the arrests was impressive, the human cost becomes clear when we examine individual cases. At the commandery of St. Martin de Vence, the local commander had no idea that his life was about to be destroyed when he rose for morning prayers on October 13. This man had probably spent decades serving the order, managing agricultural estates, providing hospitality to pilgrims, and maintaining the spiritual disciplines that define Templar life. Within hours, he found himself chained in a dungeon, accused of crimes that would have horrified him and facing torture that would break his will and destroy his faith. The psychological shock of the arrests cannot be overstated. These men had devoted their lives to serving God and protecting Christian interests, and they suddenly found themselves branded as heretics and blasphemers. Many of the arrested Templars were elderly veterans of the Crusades who had risked their lives fighting Muslim forces in the Holy Land. Others were administrators and craftsmen who had spent their careers managing the complex economic operations that made the order so powerful. Jacques de Mollay's personal experience exemplifies the broader tragedy. At 73 years old, Mollay had been Grand Master since around 1298, and he had spent decades managing the order's transition from its original crusading mission to its new role as Europe's premier financial institution. He was an experienced administrator and a skilled diplomat who had successfully navigated the complex political relationships that kept the Templars powerful. But none of this experience had prepared him for the kind of existential threat that Philip and Nogaret had created. Mollay's arrest was particularly humiliating because of his status and age. The man who had once commanded the respect of kings and popes found himself stripped of his white habit, chained like a common criminal, and dragged through the streets of Paris to the Conciergerie, the royal prison where he would spend the next 7 years. The contrast between his former dignity and his current degradation was designed to demonstrate that no one, regardless of their previous power or status, was beyond the reach of Philip's vengeance. The Inquisition machine gears up. The transfer of the arrested Templars to inquisitorial custody was a crucial development that would determine the entire course of the trials. Philip couldn't simply execute the Templars as criminals without providing some kind of legal justification that would satisfy both his own subjects and the international community. By handing them over to the Inquisition on charges of heresy, Philip was ensuring that their destruction would appear to be a religious necessity rather than a political convenience. The Inquisition had developed sophisticated methods for dealing with accused heretics over the centuries since its establishment in the early 13th century. Unlike secular courts that focused primarily on punishment, inquisitorial courts were theoretically designed to save souls by forcing heretics to confess their errors and return to Orthodox Christian faith. In practice, this meant that the Inquisition had both the moral justification and the practical experience necessary to use torture systematically and scientifically. The inquisitors who took charge of the Templar cases were not sadistic thugs acting on impulse. They were educated clergy who had studied theology, canon law, and the proper procedures for investigating heresy. They understood that confessions extracted through torture were not necessarily reliable, but they also believed that the threat of torture, combined with spiritual counseling and the promise of mercy for those who confessed, could convince genuine heretics to admit their errors and seek forgiveness. Guillaume de Nogaret played a crucial role in directing the inquisitorial proceedings. As keeper of the seal and Philip's chief legal advisor, Nogaret was responsible for coordinating between the royal administration and the inquisitorial courts. He was active in getting renegade members of the order to give evidence against their fellows, and the proceedings against the Templars bear clear traces of his unscrupulous and merciless approach to legal manipulation. The legal framework for the Templar trials was complex and would evolve over the 7 years that the cases continued. Initially, the trials were conducted under French royal authority, with the Inquisition acting as Philip's agents. But Pope Clement V's intervention would eventually create a parallel papal investigation that would run alongside the French trials, creating a confusing and contradictory legal situation that the Templars would never be able to navigate successfully. The science of breaking human beings. Medieval torture was not the random brutality that many people imagine. It was a systematic and carefully regulated practice that had been refined over centuries of use by inquisitorial courts across Europe. The inquisitors who began interrogating the Templars in late 1307 were experts in the psychology of pain and fear, and they understood exactly how to use physical suffering to extract the confessions they needed. Torture methods used against the Templars were chosen specifically to cause maximum psychological impact while avoiding immediate death. The goal was not to kill the prisoners, but to convince them that death was inevitable unless they confessed to the charges against them. This required a delicate balance between inflicting unbearable pain and maintaining the prisoner's ability to speak coherently. The strappado was one of the most commonly used torture methods, and it was employed extensively against the Templars. The victim's hands were bound behind his back, and then he was suspended by his wrists, typically resulting in dislocated shoulders. The levels of pain and resistance varied by victim depending on the victim's weight and on any additional weights added to the body. The proper application of the strappado technique caused permanent but not visible damage, which was crucial for maintaining the fiction that confessions were voluntary. The torture wasn't applied randomly, but followed a carefully planned progression designed to break the victim's resistance systematically. The process might begin with the victim simply being shown the torture devices and having their use explained in detail. Many prisoners confessed at this stage, terrified by the prospect of what they were about to endure. For those who maintained their innocence, the torture would begin with less severe methods and gradually escalate until the victim's resistance was completely broken. The rack was another favorite technique of the inquisitors. The victim was strapped to a wooden frame with his ankles and wrists bound to rollers at opposite ends. The rollers were then slowly turned, stretching the victim's body until his joints dislocated with audible pops. The psychological impact of hearing your own bones breaking was often as effective as the physical pain itself. If the torturer continued turning the rollers, the victim's arms and legs could be torn off, but this was usually avoided because dead prisoners couldn't provide useful confessions. Fire was used in various creative and horrifying ways. Some Templars had the soles of their feet smeared with animal fat and then held over hot coals, causing unimaginable agony with every step they tried to take. Others were subjected to red-hot irons applied to sensitive parts of their bodies. The smell of burning flesh and the screams of the victims were designed to terrorize other prisoners who were awaiting their turn. More subtle methods were often equally effective in breaking a prisoner's will. Sleep deprivation, combined with constant interrogation by teams of questioners working in shifts, could destroy a man's sanity without leaving any physical marks. Prisoners were denied the opportunity to relieve themselves, forcing them to stand in their own filth while answering increasingly bewildering questions from interrogators who alternated between cruel threats and apparent compassion. The inquisitors also used sophisticated psychological techniques that were remarkably modern in their understanding of human psychology. Prisoners were told that their brothers had already confessed to terrible crimes, that their order had been completely destroyed, and that their only hope of survival lay in cooperation with their captors. These tactics were designed to create despair and hopelessness, making the prisoners more likely to confess to whatever charges were brought against them. The confessions began to flow. Under these conditions, it's hardly surprising that confessions began almost immediately. Jacques de Molay himself, the Grand Master who had once commanded the entire Templar order, appeared before inquisitors on October 24, 1307, just 11 days after his arrest, and admitted to abandoning Christ and spitting on the cross. This confession was extracted after days of torture and psychological pressure that had completely broken the will of a man who had previously been one of the most powerful figures in medieval Europe. Molay's confession was particularly crucial because it gave credibility to all the other confessions that would follow. If the Grand Master himself admitted that the charges were true, how could lesser members of the order claim innocence? The inquisitors understood the propaganda value of Molay's confession and made sure that news of it spread quickly throughout the network of Templar prisoners. This created a psychological cascade effect, as other Templars concluded that resistance was hopeless if even their supreme leader had been broken. But Molay's confession included a telling detail that suggested the true nature of what was happening. He declared that he had renounced with his mouth but not with his heart. This distinction between outward compliance and inner belief was crucial to understanding the entire Templar trial process. The torture was so severe that virtually no one could resist it indefinitely, but many of the Templars who confessed under duress maintained their innocence in their own minds and would later attempt to recant their confessions when they believed it was safe to do so. The specific charges that the Templars were forced to confess to were designed to be as shocking and disgusting as possible to medieval Christian audiences. They were accused of denying Christ during secret initiation ceremonies, of spitting on the cross, of worshipping a mysterious idol called Baphomet, of engaging in homosexual practices with each other, and of various other forms of heresy and blasphemy. These accusations were almost certainly fabricated by Guillaume de Nogaret and his agents, but they were exactly the kind of charges that would justify the complete destruction of the order in the minds of ordinary Christians. The confessions followed a predictable pattern that strongly suggests they were coerced rather than voluntary. Nearly all of the accused Templars confessed to essentially the same crimes, using very similar language and describing very similar rituals. This consistency might seem to support the validity of the accusations, but it actually suggests that the prisoners were being forced to confess to a predetermined list of charges rather than being allowed to describe their actual experiences. The uniformity of the confessions becomes even more suspicious when compared to the testimony of Templars in other countries where torture was not routinely used. In England, where torture was illegal in normal legal proceedings, the English Templars largely maintained their innocence. This created an awkward situation where French Templars were confessing to terrible crimes while English Templars in the same order were claiming complete innocence. The psychological destruction of an order. The impact of the arrests and torture extended far beyond the immediate physical suffering of the prisoners. The Templars had been a brotherhood united by shared vows, common purpose, and mutual loyalty. The systematic use of torture and coerced confessions was designed to destroy these bonds and turn the Templars against each other. Guillaume de Nogaret was particularly skilled at exploiting the psychological vulnerabilities of religious communities. He understood that men who had devoted their lives to serving God and protecting Christian interests would be particularly vulnerable to accusations of heresy and blasphemy. The torture wasn't just designed to extract confessions, it was designed to convince the Templars themselves that they had somehow betrayed everything they claimed to believe in. The isolation of individual prisoners was a crucial part of this psychological warfare. By preventing the Templars from communicating with each other, the Inquisitors could control the information that each prisoner received about what was happening to his brothers. This allowed them to claim that other Templars had already confessed to terrible crimes, even when this might not be true, creating a sense of despair and abandonment that made resistance seem pointless. The deliberate destruction of the Templars' sense of identity and purpose was perhaps the most cruel aspect of the entire process. These men had spent their lives believing that they were soldiers of Christ, fighting to protect Christian interests and serving God through their vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. The torture and forced confessions were designed to convince them that they had actually been serving Satan, that their entire lives had been based on lies and blasphemy. The Pope faces an impossible choice. Pope Clement V found himself in an impossible position as news of the arrests and confessions reached him at his court in Avignon. On one hand, he was outraged that Philip had acted without papal authority and had arrested members of a religious order that answered directly to Rome. On the other hand, the confessions were so serious and so numerous that he couldn't simply dismiss them without investigation. Clement's initial response was to demand that Philip turn the prisoners over to papal custody so that the Church could conduct its own investigation. Philip refused, arguing that the Templars were French subjects who had committed crimes on French soil and therefore fell under French jurisdiction. This created a jurisdictional dispute that would complicate the entire trial process and ultimately work to Philip's advantage. The political pressure on Clement was enormous. Philip had demonstrated his willingness to challenge papal authority directly through his previous conflict with Pope Boniface Roman VIII, and Clement understood that open confrontation with the French king could have catastrophic consequences for the Church. At the same time, Clement was receiving reports of confessions from hundreds of Templars across France, confessions that seemed to confirm the most shocking accusations against the order. Under enormous pressure from Philip and faced with hundreds of confessions from Templars across France, Clement eventually capitulated. On November 22, 1307, he issued the papal bull Pastoralis Praemunentii, which ordered all Christian monarchs to arrest the Templars in their territories and confiscate their property in the name of the Pope and the Church. This gave Philip's actions retroactive papal approval and ensured that the destruction of the Templars would be a Europe-wide phenomenon rather than just a French affair. But Clement's decision to support Philip came with a crucial caveat that would create ongoing conflict between the king and the Pope. The Pope insisted that all Templar property should ultimately be transferred to the Church rather than to secular rulers. This created a new source of tension that would simmer throughout the trials and ultimately prevent Philip from achieving all of his financial goals. The arrests spread across Europe. Following Clement's papal bull, arrests began across Christian Europe, but the results varied dramatically from country to country. King Edward Roman II of England, who had initially resisted Philip's requests, was forced to comply with papal orders and arrest the English Templars in January 1308. However, the English legal system did not permit the routine use of torture, and the English Templars largely maintained their innocence. This created a significant problem for Philip's propaganda campaign. If the charges against the Templars were true, why were French Templars confessing while English Templars in the same order were claiming innocence? The contrast between the French and English trials was so stark that it became clear to many observers that the confessions in France were being extracted through torture rather than representing genuine admissions of guilt. In other parts of Europe, local rulers used the Templar trials as an opportunity to advance their own political agendas. Some seized Templar property for themselves, others used the trials to eliminate political enemies, and still others ignored the papal orders entirely and protected the Templars in their territories. The result was a patchwork of different outcomes that further undermined the credibility of the charges against the order. The geographic variation in how the Templar trials were conducted provides crucial evidence about the nature of the charges against the order. In countries where torture was routinely used, Templars confessed to the accusations. In countries where torture was illegal or rarely used, Templars maintained their innocence. This pattern strongly suggests that the confessions were coerced rather than voluntary, and that the charges against the Templars were fabricated rather than genuine. The machine of destruction grinds forward. As 1307 turned into 1308, it became clear that the Templar trials would not end quickly or quietly. What had begun as Philip's desperate attempt to solve his financial problems had become a European-wide crisis that was testing the limits of papal authority and challenging fundamental assumptions about the relationship between secular and religious power. The daily reality for the imprisoned Templars was one of constant fear, physical agony, and psychological torment. Those who had confessed under torture lived in terror that they would be subjected to further questioning if their answers were deemed insufficient. Those who maintained their innocence faced the certainty of continued torture until their resistance was finally broken. Guillaume de Nogaret continued to play a central role in directing the trials, ensuring that the legal proceedings served Philip's political and financial interests. Nogaret was active in getting renegade members of the order to give evidence against their fellows, and he worked tirelessly to prevent any possibility that the Templars might escape destruction through legal technicalities or papal intervention. The confession extracted through torture had provided Philip with the legal justification he needed to destroy the Templars, but they had also created new problems. Other European rulers were watching to see whether Philip could get away with destroying a papal order, and the implications for their own relationships with the Church were enormous. Trials had become a test case for the balance of power between secular and religious authority in medieval Europe. Meanwhile, the Templars themselves were caught in an impossible situation. Those who maintained their innocence were subjected to continued torture, while those who confessed were promised mercy that never seemed to materialize. The trials had become a grinding war of attrition that would continue for years and ultimately consume hundreds of lives. The empty treasury that Philip's agents had discovered at the Paris Temple continued to be a source of frustration for the king. While he had succeeded in seizing vast amounts of Templar real estate and agricultural property, he still lacked the liquid assets he needed to solve his immediate financial crisis. This meant that the destruction of the Templars would have to be a long-term project rather than the quick financial fix that Philip had originally envisioned. As the second year of the trials began, Jacques de Molay and the other senior Templars were beginning to understand the true scope of what Philip and Nogaret had accomplished. The coordinated arrests of October 13th, 1307 had not just destroyed the Templars as an organized force, they had also created a legal and political situation that made it almost impossible for the order to survive. The Dawn raids had been just the beginning of a story that would take another 6 years to reach its final, tragic conclusion. The Pope's secret investigation unraveling the truth. By early 1308, Pope Clement V found himself trapped between his conscience and his political survival, facing the most complex crisis of his papacy. The massive scale of the confessions extracted from Templars across France had created enormous pressure for him to accept Philip's version of events, but reports reaching him from other parts of Europe told a very different story. In England, where torture was not routinely used in legal proceedings, the Templars were maintaining their innocence with remarkable consistency. This stark contrast suggested that the French confessions were not voluntary admissions of guilt but the products of systematic torture. The geographic variation in confession patterns provided compelling evidence about the nature of the charges against the order. In France, where Guillaume de Nogaret had perfected the use of torture to extract predetermined confessions, nearly every Templar eventually admitted to the accusations against them. But in England, Scotland, and Ireland, where torture was illegal or rarely used, the results were dramatically different. The English Templars subjected to questioning by inquisitors without torture consistently maintained their innocence, often to the point of exasperation for their interrogators. This pattern was so consistent that it could not be accidental. When torture was applied, Templars confessed to heresy, blasphemy, and sexual misconduct. When torture was not applied, they denied all charges with remarkable unanimity. The logical conclusion was inescapable: the confessions were being extracted through physical and psychological coercion rather than representing genuine admissions of guilt. Clement's response to this impossible situation was characteristically cautious, but ultimately crucial to understanding what really happened during the Templar trials. Between June 28th and July 1st, 1308, the Pope conducted his own secret investigation at Poitiers, personally questioning 72 Templars who had been brought from French prisons under papal protection. Unlike the French inquisitors, who were working to confirm predetermined charges developed by Guillaume de Nogaret, Clement was genuinely trying to discover the truth about the accusations against the order. The conditions under which Clement conducted his investigation were fundamentally different from those employed by the French inquisitors. The Templars brought to Poitiers were promised papal protection and assured that they would not be subjected to further torture regardless of what they revealed. They were provided with adequate food, clothing, and medical attention to help them recover from the effects of their imprisonment. Most importantly, they were questioned by papal officials who had no predetermined agenda and were genuinely seeking to understand the truth about Templar practices. The results of this papal investigation were shocking and would remain secret for centuries. On July 2, 1808, Pope Clement granted absolutions to the Templars who had confessed during the French trials, but the nature of these absolutions revealed the truth about the charges. The Pope did not absolve the Templars from heresy because he had found no evidence of heretical beliefs or practices. Instead, he absolved them from improper practices following the initiation of new Templars, minor ritual irregularities that were well documented in the accusations but fell far short of the serious charges of heresy and blasphemy that Philip was using to justify the destruction of the entire order. The distinction between these minor ritual improprieties and the serious charges of heresy was crucial to understanding Clement's findings. The Pope's investigation had uncovered evidence that some Templar initiation ceremonies included practices that were inappropriate but not heretical. These might have included hazing rituals, crude humor, or other behaviors that were unseemly for a religious order but did not constitute denial of Christian faith or worship of false idols. Such practices would warrant correction and penance, but they would not justify the destruction of an entire order or the execution of its members. Even more significant was a parallel investigation that Clement conducted at Chinon between August 14th and 20th, 1308. During this investigation, Jacques de Molay and the 3 other highest-ranking Templars were questioned by a group of cardinals sent directly by the Pope. The Chinon parchment, which documented this investigation, would remain hidden in the Vatican secret archives for 7 centuries before being rediscovered in 2001. The Chinon investigation reached the same conclusions as the Poitiers hearing. The cardinals found no evidence of heresy or serious wrongdoing, and they absolved the Templar leaders of all charges. Jacques de Molay and his companions were declared to be in communion with the Church and were allowed to receive the Christian sacraments. If the charges against the Templars had been genuine, the Pope would never have granted these absolutions. This secret papal investigation proves conclusively that the highest authorities in the Catholic Church, acting independently and using their own investigative methods, found the charges against the Templars to be either false or grossly exaggerated. But Clement's political weakness and his dependence on French support made it impossible for him to act publicly on these findings. The Pope, who had discovered the truth about the Templars' innocence, would ultimately be forced to participate in their destruction. Guillaume de Nogaret amassed to manipulate it behind the destruction. The architect of the Templar destruction was not King Philip Roman IV himself, but his brilliant and utterly amoral chief advisor, Guillaume de Nogaret. Born around 1260 in St. Felix, Lower Guise in the Haute-Garonne, Nogaret came from a family of relatively modest origins that held a small ancestral property of servile origin. This humble background would prove crucial to understanding his later ruthlessness in pursuing royal interests, as Noggart had none of the aristocratic scruples that might have constrained a nobleman in similar circumstances. Noggart's rise to power was based purely on intellectual ability and complete devotion to royal authority. In 1291, he was a professor of jurisprudence at the University of Montpellier, demonstrating the legal expertise that would make him invaluable to Philip Roman IV. By 1296, he had become a member of the Curia Regis at Paris, the royal council that advised the king on matters of law and policy. From 1306, he was seigneur of several properties in Languedoc, reflecting the wealth and status he had achieved through royal service. But Noggart's real specialty was not academic law or administrative competence. It was the art of destroying the king's enemies through legal manipulation and propaganda campaigns. His name is mainly connected with a bitter quarrel between Philip Roman IV and Pope Boniface Roman VIII, during which Noggart demonstrated the methods he would later perfect in the destruction of the Templars. In 1300, he was sent as an ambassador to Boniface, of which he left a highly coloured and deliberately inflammatory account that portrayed the Pope as an enemy of France and Christianity. Noggart's influence over Philip dates from February 1303, when he persuaded the king to consent to an audacious plan of seizing Pope Boniface Roman VIII and bringing him forcibly from Italy to face trial before a council in France. This plan demonstrated Noggart's understanding that even the most powerful enemies could be destroyed if sufficient violence was combined with legal justification and propaganda preparation. On March 7th, he received a secret commission from the royal chancery to go to certain places and make such treaties with such persons as seemed good to them, language deliberately vague enough to provide legal cover for any actions he might take. The attack on Pope Boniface at Anagni in September 1303 established the template that Noggart would later use against the Templars. The operation combined careful intelligence gathering, coordination with local allies, overwhelming surprise, and a propaganda campaign designed to justify the violence as necessary for the protection of Christianity. Although the immediate attack failed when local inhabitants rallied to defend the Pope, Boniface died within weeks of the assault, probably from the shock and humiliation he had suffered. For his role in the attack on Pope Boniface, Noggart was excommunicated by the new Pope, Benedict Roman XI, in 1304. But Philip Roman IV showed him increased favour rather than abandoning him, demonstrating the king's complete commitment to supporting his most effective advisor. Noggart's excommunication would later be lifted through Philip's political manoeuvring, but only on the condition that he undertake a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, a requirement that remained unfulfilled at the time of his death in April 1313. Noggart's role in the destruction of the Templars began years before the arrests of October 1307. He was responsible for developing the legal and propaganda framework that would justify the destruction of the order, collecting testimonies from disgruntled former Templars, and coordinating with inquisitorial authorities to ensure that the trials would produce the desired results. The Catholic Encyclopedia notes that he was active in getting renegade members of the order to give evidence against their fellows, demonstrating his skill at exploiting personal grievances and manipulating witnesses. The charges that Noggart developed against the Templars were carefully designed to be as shocking and disgusting as possible to medieval Christian audiences. The accusations of denying Christ, spitting on the cross, worshipping idols, and engaging in homosexual practices were chosen not because there was evidence to support them, but because they would make it impossible for anyone to defend the Templars without appearing to defend heresy itself. Noggart understood that in the medieval world, the mere accusation of such crimes would be enough to destroy the order's reputation, regardless of whether the charges could be proven. The horror of medieval prison life, the physical and psychological suffering of the arrested Templars began immediately upon their capture and would continue for years as they awaited trial and execution. The conditions in medieval prisons were horrific by any standard, but the treatment of the Templars was particularly harsh because Philip and Noggart wanted to break their resistance as quickly as possible. Jacques de Molay and the other senior Templars were imprisoned in the Conciergerie, the royal prison on the Isle de la Cité in Paris. The Conciergerie had been converted from part of the royal palace into a prison in 1391, but it had been used for holding important prisoners for decades before its official conversion. The building's location on an island in the Seine River made escape nearly impossible, while its proximity to the royal court ensured that the prisoners would be readily available for interrogation. The conditions of imprisonment at the Conciergerie varied dramatically depending on the prisoner's wealth, status, and willingness to cooperate with their captors. The most privileged prisoners, usually wealthy nobles who could afford to pay for better treatment, might have their own cells with beds, desks, and materials for reading and writing. These prisoners could receive visitors, purchase additional food and clothing, and generally maintain some semblance of their former status. But the Templars were not treated as privileged prisoners, despite their former wealth and status. Most were confined to cells called pistoles, which were equipped with only a rough bed and perhaps a table. These cells were cold, damp, and poorly ventilated, providing minimal protection from the elements. The prisoners were given only the most basic food and clothing, barely sufficient to keep them alive. The poorest and most uncooperative prisoners were confined to the most horrible accommodations the conciergerie had to offer. These were the oubliettes, cells whose name literally meant forgotten places. The oubliettes were dark, damp, vermin-infested dungeons that received little or no natural light. Water gathered in puddles on the earthen floors, creating perfect breeding grounds for disease-carrying rats and insects. Many prisoners confined to the oubliettes died from illness, malnutrition, or despair before they could be brought to trial. The daily routine for prisoners at the conciergerie was designed to break their spirits and make them more compliant during interrogation. Prisoners were allowed to walk in the prisoners' gallery from 8 a.m. until an hour before sunset, but this privilege could be revoked at any time for disciplinary reasons. Roll call was a deliberately torturous proceeding that could take hours to complete, as many of the jailers were illiterate and had difficulty keeping accurate records. The psychological impact of imprisonment was often more devastating than the physical hardships. The Templars had gone from being members of one of Europe's most powerful and respected organizations to being branded as heretics and criminals. The contrast between their former status and their current degradation was designed to convince them that resistance was hopeless and that their only chance of survival lay in cooperation with their captors. Visitors were allowed only at the discretion of the principal jailer, whose decisions depended more on his mood and the size of any bribes offered than on any established procedures. This arbitrary system meant that prisoners could be completely cut off from the outside world for weeks or months at a time, increasing their sense of isolation and despair. The uncertainty about when or whether they would be allowed to see friends or family members added another layer of psychological torture to their ordeal. Jacques de Molay finds his courage. The 73-year-old Grand Master had been broken by months of imprisonment, torture, and psychological pressure when he first confessed to the charges against his order in October 1307. His confession had been extracted after days of physical and mental agony that had temporarily destroyed his will to resist. But as he recovered from the immediate trauma of his arrest and torture, Molay began to grasp the full scope of what Philip and Guillaume de Nogaret had accomplished. The papal investigation at Chinon in August 1308 marked a crucial turning point in Jacques de Molay's ordeal and in his understanding of his duty as Grand Master. When Pope Clement sent his cardinals to investigate the charges against the Templars, Molay saw an opportunity to appeal directly to papal authority and potentially save his order. But more importantly, he began to understand that his earlier confession, extracted through torture, was being used to justify the destruction of innocent men throughout Europe. The transformation that Molay underwent between his initial confession and his recantation reveals something crucial about the nature of torture and human resistance. The initial shock of arrest and the systematic application of physical and psychological pressure had broken his immediate resistance, but it had not destroyed his fundamental commitment to truth and duty. As the immediate trauma faded and he had time to reflect on what was happening, Molay's sense of responsibility to his order and to the truth reasserted itself. When the papal cardinals arrived at Chinon in August 1308, Molay made a decision that would define the rest of his life and secure his place in history. In front of the papal investigators, he showed them his tortured and bruised body and formally recanted his earlier confession. According to one source, the Grand Master said that he had confessed only under heavy torture, and he showed the wounds on his body as evidence of the coercion he had endured. He declared that the charges against the Templars were false and that his previous admissions had been extracted through physical force and psychological manipulation. This recantation was an act of extraordinary courage that Molay knew would likely cost him his life. Under the rules of the Inquisition, prisoners who recanted their confessions were considered relapsed heretics and were handed over to secular authorities to be burned. Molay understood these rules perfectly, yet he chose to recant anyway because he understood that his duty as Grand Master required him to defend his order even at the ultimate price. Mole's recantation was not just a personal decision, it was a strategic choice that demonstrated his understanding of the broader political and religious implications of the Templar trials. By formally denying the charges in front of papal investigators, Mole was appealing to the highest authority in the Catholic Church and creating an official record that contradicted the French version of events. He was gambling that papal authority would ultimately prevail over French political manipulation. The risk that Mole took in recanting his confession was enormous, but so was the potential reward. If the papal investigation concluded that the charges against the Templars were false, and if the Pope acted on that conclusion, the entire French case would collapse. The order might be saved, and the hundreds of Templars languishing in prisons across Europe might be freed. Mole was willing to sacrifice his own life for the possibility of saving his brothers and preserving the honor of the order he had served for decades. But Mole's courage came at a terrible personal cost. By recanting his confession, he was essentially signing his own death warrant. Philip and Nogart could not allow the Grand Master to publicly deny charges that formed the foundation of their entire case against the Templars. Mole's recantation threatened to expose the fraudulent nature of the French trials and potentially save the order, which meant that he had to be silenced permanently. The Papal Commission and the defense of the order. In November 1309, more than 2 years after the initial arrests, Pope Clement V finally established a papal commission to investigate not just individual Templars, but the order as a whole. This commission, operating in Paris under papal rather than French authority, provided the first real opportunity for the Templars to mount an organized defense of their order. The establishment of this commission represented a partial victory for Clement in his ongoing struggle with Philip, but it would also create new opportunities for the king to manipulate the proceedings. The Papal Commission was composed of ecclesiastical authorities who were theoretically independent of French royal influence. The commissioners were instructed to investigate the charges against the Templar order as an institution, rather than focusing on the guilt or innocence of individual members. This broader mandate created the possibility that the commission might conclude that while individual Templars might have committed minor offences, the order as a whole was not heretical and should not be destroyed. When the Papal Commission began its hearings in February 1310, Cacte Mole appeared before the commissioners and once again recanted his earlier confessions. He stated clearly that he did not acknowledge the accusations against his order and that the Templars were innocent of all charges. This public recantation, made in front of papal authorities rather than French inquisitors, was even more significant than his earlier recantation at Chinon because it created an official record that could not be suppressed or ignored. But Mole was not alone in his resistance. As news of the Papal Commission spread through the network of Templar prisoners, other members of the order began to find the courage to recant their forced confessions. The knowledge that papal authorities were conducting their own investigation, separate from the French proceedings, gave the Templars hope that justice might still be possible. More than 600 Templars eventually volunteered to defend their order before the Papal Commission, a remarkable number considering that they knew such testimony could result in their execution. The Papal Commission hearings revealed the sophisticated defense strategy that some Templars had developed to counter the charges against them. Many brothers made reference to previous confessions they had made to their chaplains long before the trials began, confessions in which they had revealed the supposed sins of heresy that they were now being accused of. This defense strategy was brilliant because it demonstrated that the Templars had not been secretly practicing heresy, but had been confessing what they believed to be sins to their religious superiors according to proper church procedure. The effectiveness of this defense strategy lay in its appeal to fundamental Catholic doctrine about confession and absolution. If the Templars had genuinely believed they were committing sins during their initiation ceremonies, and if they had properly confessed these sins to their chaplains, then they had followed correct church procedure and could not be considered heretics. This argument undermined the French claims that the Templars had been secretly practicing heretical rites while pretending to be Orthodox Christians. The testimonies given before the Papal Commission provide fascinating insights into the actual practices of the Templar order and the ways in which Guillaume de Nogart had distorted minor ritual irregularities into serious charges of heresy. Some Templars admitted to practices during initiation ceremonies that were inappropriate but not heretical, such as crude humor, hazing rituals, or symbolic acts that were meant to test the commitment of new members. These practices might warrant correction and discipline, but they did not constitute the kind of systematic heresy that would justify destroying the entire order. The commissioners also heard testimony from non-Templars, including former employees, neighbors, and associates of the order. These witnesses were questioned about various matters, including the location of Templar properties and the behavior of individual Templars. The testimony of these outside witnesses was generally favorable to the Templars, describing them as pious, charitable, and devoted to their religious duties. This external testimony contradicted the French claims that the Templars were notorious heretics whose crimes were widely known. Between December 1310 and February 1311, 11 groups of Templars testified before the papal commissioners, providing detailed accounts of their experiences and their understanding of Templar practices. These testimonies reveal the courage and determination of men who were willing to risk their lives to defend the honor of their order. Many of these Templars had already been subjected to torture and coerced into making false confessions, yet they found the strength to recant those confessions and tell the truth about their order's actual practices. The papal commission proceedings also revealed the sophisticated methods that Philip and Nogart had used to manipulate the earlier trials. The commissioners discovered that many of the confessions had been extracted through torture, that witnesses had been coached in their testimony, and that evidence had been fabricated to support predetermined conclusions. This documentary evidence of French manipulation provided crucial support for the Templars' claims that they were victims of a political conspiracy rather than genuine heretics. Philip strikes back the massacre at Sens. The brave testimony of the Templars before the papal commission created a crisis for Philip Roman IV and his advisors. If hundreds of Templars were publicly recanting their confessions and declaring their innocence, the entire foundation of the French case against the order would collapse. Guillaume de Nogart and his associates understood that they had to act quickly and decisively to prevent the papal commission from undermining 7 years of careful legal and propaganda work. Philip's response was characteristically brutal and effective. The king understood that he could not directly attack the papal commission, which operated under papal rather than French authority, but he could certainly attack the individual Templars who were providing testimony that contradicted his version of events. The solution was to find a legal pretext for executing some of the most prominent Templar defenders, thereby terrorizing the others into silence. The opportunity came through the actions of Philippe de Marigny, the Archbishop of Sens and brother of one of Philip's chief ministers. On May 12, 1310, 54 Templars who had recanted their confessions were burned alive at Sens on de Marigny's orders. This mass execution was not the result of a careful legal proceeding, but a political assassination designed to terrorize other Templars into silence. The men who were burned at Sens were not random victims. They were specifically chosen because they had recanted their confessions and volunteered to defend their order before the papal commission. Their execution sent a clear message to the remaining Templars. Anyone who dared to deny the charges would face the most horrible death imaginable. The psychological impact of this massacre was devastating, as other Templars understood that papal protection was meaningless if French authorities were willing to resort to mass murder. The execution at Sens was carried out with deliberate brutality designed to maximize its psychological impact. The 54 Templars were tied to stakes across a field and burned alive in what witnesses described as a storm of smoke and ashes as a stunned crowd looked on. These men maintained their innocence even as the flames consumed them, crying out that their order was pure and holy and that the charges against them were false. Their steadfast denial of wrongdoing as they died provided powerful evidence that the confessions extracted through torture had been false. The courage shown by the Templars at Sens was extraordinary, but it also revealed the fundamental weakness of Philip's case. If the charges had been true, why would these men choose to die horrible deaths rather than admit their guilt and seek mercy? Their willingness to face execution while proclaiming their innocence demonstrated either that they were telling the truth about their order's purity, or that they were so committed to their lies that they would die for them. The former explanation was far more plausible than the latter. The massacre had since achieved Philip's immediate political goal of terrorizing the remaining Templars into submission. The Templars who had volunteered to defend their order before the papal commission suddenly found reasons to withdraw their testimony. The prospect of being burned alive was more than most men could face, especially when it became clear that papal protection was ineffective against French determination to destroy the order. But the massacre also had unintended consequences that ultimately worked against Philip's interests. The brutality of the execution shocked observers throughout Europe and raised serious questions about the legitimacy of the French proceedings. If the Templars were obviously guilty of the charges against them, why was it necessary to resort to mass murder to prevent them from testifying? The massacre suggested that Philip had something to hide and that the Templars' testimony might have been more credible than the king wanted to admit. The Pope's impossible position deepens. The massacre has since put Pope Clement V in an even more impossible position than before. His own investigation had proven that the charges against the Templars were false or greatly exaggerated, but French authorities had demonstrated their willingness to commit mass murder to maintain their version of events. Clement was faced with a choice between defending the truth and protecting what remained of papal authority in an increasingly secular world. The political pressure on Clement was enormous and came from multiple directions. Philip Roman IV had not only demonstrated his willingness to challenge papal authority directly, but he was also threatening to put the late Pope Boniface Roman VIII on trial for heresy. This threat was particularly dangerous because it would set a precedent for secular rulers to sit in judgment of the church hierarchy. Clement understood that if he pushed Philip too far, the French king might attempt to destroy the papacy itself. At the same time, Clement was receiving reports from across Europe that other rulers were watching to see whether Philip could destroy a papal order with impunity. Kings in England, Aragon, Portugal, and elsewhere were making their own calculations about how to deal with the Templars in their territories and about their relationships with papal authority more generally. If Clement appeared weak and ineffective in defending the Templars, it would encourage other secular rulers to challenge church authority in their own kingdoms. The financial implications of the Templar crisis were also weighing heavily on Clement's mind. The Pope's move to Avignon had made him financially dependent on French support, as the papal territories in Italy were no longer reliably under his control. Philip controlled access to the revenues that Clement needed to maintain the papal court and administration. Open confrontation with the French king would likely result in financial catastrophe for the papacy. Clement's personal character also played a role in his inability to defend the Templars effectively. Unlike some of his predecessors who had been willing to fight to the death for papal prerogatives, Clement was fundamentally a man of compromise who preferred negotiation to confrontation. His legal background had taught him to look for solutions that satisfied all parties, but the Templar crisis offered no possibility of compromise that would satisfy both truth and political necessity. The Pope's health was also deteriorating during this period, adding another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. Clement was suffering from various ailments that made it difficult for him to manage the day-to-day demands of the papacy, let alone engage in a prolonged confrontation with the most powerful king in Europe. This physical weakness undermined his political position and made it even more difficult for him to resist Philip's demands. The Council of Vienne, the final betrayal. The Council of Vienne, which opened in October 1311, was supposed to provide a definitive resolution to the Templar crisis, but it quickly became another arena for the struggle between papal authority and French political power. Philip Roman IV arrived at Vienne with a substantial military force, making it clear that he was prepared to use violence to ensure that the council reached the decision he wanted. The presence of French soldiers at church council was an unprecedented challenge to ecclesiastical independence that demonstrated how far the balance of power had shifted in favor of secular authority. The bishops and other ecclesiastical authorities who attended the Council of Vienne found themselves in an impossible position. They were being asked to rule on charges that many of them suspected were false, but they were also being threatened with physical violence if they reached the wrong conclusion. The council proceedings were a mockery of the judicial process, with political considerations clearly outweighing any concern for truth or justice. Under this enormous pressure, Clement made the decision that would define his papacy and destroy his historical reputation. Rather than defend the Templars' innocence based on his own investigation, Clement chose to suppress the order through administrative decree rather than judicial condemnation. On March 22, 1312, he issued the papal bull Vox in Excelso, which dissolved the Knights Templar not because they had been found guilty of the charges against them, but because the scandal surrounding them had made it impossible for them to continue their mission. This solution was legally clever but morally bankrupt. By suppressing the order administratively rather than condemning it judicially, Clement avoided having to rule on the truth or falsehood of the charges. He could claim that he was acting in the best interests of the Church by ending a controversy that was damaging to Christian unity, rather than admitting that he was bound to French political pressure. But he was also abandoning hundreds of innocent men to torture, imprisonment, and death to satisfy the political demands of a secular ruler. The Pope who had discovered the truth about the Templars' innocence became the Pope who destroyed them to preserve his own political position. Clement's decision to suppress the Templars was a betrayal not only of the order itself, but of the principles of truth and justice that the Church claimed to represent. It demonstrated that even the highest religious authority in Christendom was willing to sacrifice innocent lives to maintain political power. The aftermath of Clement's decision was immediate and devastating for the remaining Templars. With the order officially suppressed, there was no longer any legal basis for defending individual Templars or challenging their treatment by secular authorities. The men who had shown the courage to defend their order before the papal commission found themselves abandoned by the very authority they had appealed to for justice. Final years of suffering. Jacques de Molay and the other senior Templars had been held in prison for more than 6 years when Pope Clement issued the bull suppressing their order in March 1312. These men, who had once commanded respect throughout Europe, had been reduced to broken shadows of their former selves through years of imprisonment, torture, and psychological torment. The suppression of their order eliminated their last hope of official vindication, but it also freed them from any remaining obligation to remain silent about their treatment. The conditions in which the senior Templars were held during these final years were deliberately harsh, designed to break their spirits and prevent them from causing any further trouble for Philip and his advisors. They were confined to individual cells in the conciergerie with minimal contact with each other or the outside world. Their food was barely adequate to sustain life, and they were denied access to books, writing materials, or other items that might have provided intellectual or spiritual comfort. The psychological impact of their prolonged imprisonment was devastating. These men had spent their entire adult lives in service to their order and to what they believed was a holy cause. The destruction of the order and the official declaration that their life's work had been based on heresy and blasphemy was a form of spiritual torture that may have been more painful than the physical abuse they had endured. Yet some of the Templars managed to maintain their dignity and their commitment to truth despite these horrible conditions. They continued to deny the charges against their order, even when such denials brought additional punishment. Their refusal to accept the official version of events demonstrated a strength of character that their captors had been unable to break despite years of systematic abuse. The broader community of imprisoned Templars throughout France faced similar conditions during these final years. Many had been transferred to church custody following the suppression of their order, but this transfer often brought little improvement in their treatment. The ecclesiastical authorities who took charge of them were usually sympathetic to Philip's version of events and continued to treat the former Templars as dangerous heretics rather than as victims of injustice. Some Templars managed to escape or were quietly released during this period, but these were usually men who had fully confessed to the charges against them and were considered to pose no further threat to the official narrative. Those who maintained their innocence or who had been prominent in defending the order were kept under close guard until they died in prison or were executed. Final betrayal and the path to martyrdom. Jacques de Molay and the other senior Templars who had survived 7 years of imprisonment were brought before a panel of cardinals on March 11, 1314, for what was supposed to be their final sentencing hearing. These men had been reduced to broken shadows of their former selves through years of torture, imprisonment, and psychological abuse. They were expected to make a final, public confession that would bring the Templar trials to a close and vindicate Philip's actions. The cardinals who presided over this final hearing expected the proceedings to be a mere formality. After 7 years of trials, torture, and terror, surely these elderly men would be grateful for any mercy they could receive. The plan was for Molly and his companions to make public confessions, accept their sentences of perpetual imprisonment, and disappear forever into French dungeons where they could cause no further trouble for Philip or his successors. But Jacques de Molay had one last surprise for his tormentors. When called upon to make his final statement, the 73-year-old Grand Master found reserves of courage that had sustained him through 7 years of hell. Instead of the expected confession, Molay delivered a ringing denunciation of the charges against his order. He declared that the Knights Templar were innocent of all accusations, that their order was pure and holy, and that the confessions extracted from them had been the products of torture and intimidation. Geoffroy de Charny, the preceptor of Normandy and one of the other senior Templars, joined Molay in this final act of defiance. Together, these 2 old men, broken in body but not in spirit, proclaimed the innocence of their order before the assembled cardinals and spectators. They understood that this final recantation would cost them their lives, but they also understood that history would judge them by their willingness to die for the truth rather than live with lies. The reaction to this unexpected recantation was swift and brutal. Philip Roman IV could not allow the Grand Master of the Templars to publicly proclaim his order's innocence after 7 years of trials designed to prove their guilt. Within hours of Molle's statement, the cardinals declared that by recanting their previous confessions, Molle and Charny had proved themselves to be relapsed heretics. Under church law, relapsed heretics faced only one possible punishment: death by burning. The speed with which this final sentence was carried out demonstrated Philip's determination to silence Molle permanently before his words could inspire others or call into question the legitimacy of the entire proceedings. There would be no lengthy appeals, no opportunity for papal intervention, and no chance for the condemned men to change their mind. The sentences were carried out on the same day they were pronounced, ensuring that Molle and Charny would have no opportunity to cause any further trouble for their enemies. The final act of the Templar tragedy was about to begin, and it would provide Jacques de Molay with the opportunity to achieve a kind of immortality that his destroyers could never attain. The old Grand Master's final words would echo through the centuries, providing inspiration to those who face similar struggles against injustice and serving as a reminder that the human spirit cannot be completely broken by torture, imprisonment, or the threat of death. The final act, March 18, 1314. The sun was setting over the Seine River on the evening of March 18, 1314, as a small but significant crowd gathered in the Isle de la Cité to witness what would become one of history's most dramatic and consequential executions. A wooden pyre had been constructed with meticulous care on the small island that would later be known as the Isle d'Estuars, positioned strategically so that the flames would be visible from both banks of the river, from the towers of Notre Dame Cathedral, and from the windows of the royal palace itself. This was not meant to be a quiet execution hidden away from public view. This was intended as a final demonstration of royal power and a definitive end to the Templar controversy that had consumed France for 7 long and bitter years. The choice of location was deeply symbolic and had been calculated with the same precision that Philip Roman IV and his advisors had brought to every aspect of the Templar destruction. The Isle de la Cité was the beating heart of royal and ecclesiastical power in France, home to both the royal palace where Philip ruled and Notre Dame Cathedral where the highest officials of the French Church conducted their most solemn ceremonies. By executing the last Templars in the shadow of these twin monuments to secular and religious authority, Philip Roman IV was making a final, unmistakable statement about the supremacy of royal power over all other forms of authority, including the international religious orders that had once operated beyond his reach. The method of execution had been chosen with equal care and attention to both practical and symbolic considerations. Death by burning was reserved in medieval France for the most serious crimes against God and King, particularly heresy, treason, and other offences that were believed to corrupt both the soul and the social order. The slow, agonizing death that resulted from this method was intended to serve multiple purposes: to demonstrate the horrible fate that awaited those who dared to challenge royal authority or Christian orthodoxy, to provide an opportunity for last-minute confession and repentance, and to purify the souls of the condemned through the cleansing power of fire. Medieval execution by burning followed established procedures that had been refined over centuries of use. The condemned were typically chained to wooden stakes that were surrounded by carefully arranged combustible materials. The arrangement of the fuel was crucial to the effectiveness of the execution as both punishment and public spectacle. Green wood was often mixed with seasoned timber to create a fire that would burn slowly and produce maximum smoke and heat while prolonging the agony of the condemned. The positioning of the stakes ensured that the victims would be clearly visible to the crowd throughout their ordeal, maximizing the psychological impact on observers. Jacques de Molay and Geoffrey de Charny were brought to the execution site in heavy chains, 2 broken old men who had been reduced to shadows of their former selves by 7 years of imprisonment, systematic torture, and relentless psychological torment. At 73 years old, Molay could barely walk without assistance, his once powerful frame ravaged by years of poor nutrition, damp prison conditions, and the cumulative effects of the physical and mental abuse he had endured. His hair had turned completely white during his captivity, his face was gaunt and deeply lined with the marks of suffering, and his body bore visible scars from the torture sessions that had extracted his initial confession. Charny, the former preceptor of Normandy and one of the most respected military commanders in the Templar Order, was similarly weakened by age and the brutalities of his imprisonment. Yet, despite their physical deterioration, both men maintained a dignity and inner strength that their captors had been unable to destroy despite years of systematic cruelty designed specifically to break their spirits. Observers who witnessed their final walk to the pyre noted that both men carried themselves with a calm composure that seemed almost supernatural given the horrible death they were about to face. The physical appearance of the two condemned men provided stark and horrible testimony to the brutality they had endured during their 7 years of captivity. Their bodies showed the permanent effects of torture, malnutrition, and the psychological stress of their ordeal. Yet there was something in their bearing, in the way they held their heads high and walked steadily toward their death, that suggested an inner strength that had not been broken by their suffering. This quiet dignity would prove to be more powerful than any of their captors had anticipated. The theater and science of medieval execution. Medieval executions were carefully choreographed events that served multiple complex purposes beyond the simple elimination of criminals. They were public demonstrations of royal and ecclesiastical power, religious ceremonies designed to save souls through final opportunities for confession and repentance, and social rituals that reinforce community values and hierarchies. The execution of Jacques de Molay and Geoffrey de Charny incorporated all of these traditional elements, but it also had additional dimensions that made it unique in the annals of medieval justice. The pyre itself had been constructed with deliberate attention to both practical effectiveness and symbolic meaning. Professional executioners, who took pride in their skill at managing the complex technical and psychological aspects of death by burning, had supervised its construction. The wood was arranged in specific patterns designed to ensure that the fire would burn slowly and steadily, guaranteeing that the condemned men would suffer for an extended period before death finally claimed them. The stakes to which they would be chained were positioned at precisely calculated heights to ensure maximum visibility to the crowd while allowing the flames to consume the victims' bodies completely. The choice of fuel reflected centuries of experience with execution by burning. Green wood was deliberately mixed with seasoned timber to create a fire that would produce maximum smoke and heat while burning slowly enough to prolong the agony. The psychological impact of this slow burning was considered as important as the physical punishment, as it provided time for the condemned to contemplate their sins, make final confessions, and potentially achieve salvation even as their bodies were destroyed. The dense smoke would also carry the smell of burning flesh throughout the surrounding area, serving as a powerful reminder to all who witnessed it of the consequences of challenging royal authority. The crowd that gathered to witness the execution was unusually diverse and subdued for such an event, reflecting the complex and controversial nature of the Templar trials. Medieval executions typically attracted carnival-like crowds, with vendors selling food and drink, entertainers performing for the assembled masses, and spectators treating the proceedings as a form of public entertainment. The execution of criminals was considered both a moral lesson and a social event, an opportunity for the community to come together and witness the triumph of justice over evil. But there was something markedly different about this execution that seemed to subdue the normal festive atmosphere and create an air of tension and uncertainty among the spectators. Perhaps it was the advanced age and obvious frailty of the condemned men, who appeared more like broken grandfathers than dangerous heretics. Perhaps it was the growing awareness among the French people that the charges against the Templars might not have been genuine, or the uncomfortable knowledge that these men had served France faithfully for decades before being branded as traitors. Whatever the cause, the crowd was unusually quiet and thoughtful as they waited for the execution to begin. Representatives of the church were present in significant numbers to offer final rites and to encourage the condemned men to make last confessions that might save their souls from damnation. These clerics had been carefully chosen for their loyalty to the official version of events and their ability to resist any attempt by the Templars to make public declarations of innocence that might undermine the legal proceedings. Their presence served both a religious function, providing spiritual comfort to the dying, and a political one, as they were expected to testify later that the condemned men had died as penitent heretics rather than as martyrs for their cause. Royal officials were also present in large numbers, representing the triumph of Philip Roman IV's vision of centralized royal authority over the medieval ideal of international religious orders that answered only to the Pope. These men had spent years working to destroy the Templars, and they were there to witness the final vindication of their efforts. Their presence was both a security measure, designed to prevent any last-minute rescue attempts or popular uprising, and a symbolic statement about the new balance of power in medieval Europe. The executioners who would carry out the sentence were skilled professionals who understood the precise timing and techniques required to maximize both the physical suffering and the symbolic impact of death by burning. These men had extensive experience in managing crowds, controlling the rate of burning, and ensuring that the condemned remained conscious and capable of speech for as long as possible. They knew how to position the victims to ensure maximum visibility, how to arrange the fuel to control the progression of the flames, and how to manage the psychological dynamics of the crowd's reaction to the inevitable horror of watching human beings burnt alive. Guillaume de Nogaret, the architect's mysterious end. One of the most remarkable and ominous aspects of what would become known as the Templar curse was that it began claiming victims even before Jacques de Molay spoke his final prophetic words from the flames. Guillaume de Nogaret, the brilliant and utterly ruthless architect of the Templars' destruction, had died unexpectedly in April 1313, almost a full year before the execution of the Grand Master, under circumstances that remain mysterious and suggestive to this day. Nogaret's death was particularly shocking because it occurred at the absolute height of his power and influence, just as he was preparing for the final phase of the Templar trials that would complete his masterwork of legal and political manipulation. He had been Keeper of the Seal since 1307, a position that made him one of the most powerful men in France, responsible for authenticating all royal documents and serving as Philip Romanfort's chief legal advisor in the most sensitive matters of state. His influence over the king was enormous and had only grown stronger over the years as Philip came to depend more and more heavily on Nogaret's intellectual brilliance and complete lack of moral scruples. The timing of Nogaret's death was particularly suspicious given that he had been deeply involved in royal affairs concerning Flanders as late as the end of March 1313, just weeks before his sudden demise. There was no indication that his health was failing, no evidence that his position was in jeopardy, and no suggestion that he was experiencing any of the political or personal problems that might have led to a natural death. Instead, Nogaret simply disappeared from the historical record, dying suddenly and without explanation at the very moment when his long campaign against the Templars was approaching its climax. The circumstances surrounding Nogaret's death gave rise to persistent speculation that he might have been murdered, possibly by agents working for surviving Templars or their sympathizers. Some sources suggest that he was killed by mercury-based poison delivered through a specially prepared candle, a method that would have been both virtually untraceable using medieval forensic techniques and symbolically appropriate for a man who had spent his career illuminating dark corners where he could fabricate evidence and manipulate legal proceedings. The use of mercury poison would have caused symptoms that medieval physicians would have been unable to diagnose or treat, allowing the murder to appear as a natural death. Nogaret's sudden death deprived Philip Romanfort of his most capable and experienced advisor at the most crucial moment of the entire Templar affair. The king had come to rely heavily on Nogaret's legal expertise, his talent for political manipulation, his extensive network of informants and agents, and most importantly, his complete willingness to use any methods necessary to achieve royal objectives. Without Nogaret's guidance and oversight, Philip was forced to rely on less capable advisors like Enghien de Marigny, who possessed neither the intellectual brilliance nor the ruthless determination that had made Nogaret so effective in destroying the Templars. This change in leadership may have contributed significantly to the less careful handling of the final Templar executions and the failure to prevent Jacques de Molay from making his dramatic final statement. Nogaret would almost certainly have recognized the enormous danger of giving the Grand Master any opportunity to address the crowd, and he would have taken elaborate precautions to ensure that the executions proceeded without any dramatic declarations that might undermine the official narrative. His absence from the final act of the drama he had so carefully orchestrated may have been the critical factor that allowed Molay's curse to achieve the power and impact that would resonate through the centuries. More broadly, Nogaret's death was interpreted by many contemporaries as the first unmistakable sign that divine justice was beginning to work against those who had participated in the destruction of the Templars. The man who had fabricated the charges against the order, who had manipulated legal proceedings to ensure predetermined outcomes, who had orchestrated the systematic torture and execution of innocent men, had been struck down at the very moment of his greatest triumph. His death served as a warning to others who had participated in the destruction of the Templars that they too might face divine retribution for their crimes against justice and truth. The Dordanesle affair or dynasty begins to crumble. Even before Jacques de Molay spoke his famous curse, the Capetian dynasty was already showing signs of the internal decay that would ultimately lead to its extinction. The Tour de Nesle affair, which erupted in 1314 just months after Malé's execution, represented the first dramatic fulfillment of the Grand Master's prophecy that Philip Romanfort's royal line would not endure. This scandal, involving adultery at the highest levels of the royal family, created a succession crisis that would have consequences far beyond anything its participants could have imagined. The scandal began with what appeared to be a simple family visit in 1313, when Isabella of France, who had married Edward Roman II of England, returned to Paris to visit her father Philip Romanfort and her 3 brothers. Isabella was an intelligent and observant woman who had inherited something of her father's political cunning, and during her visit she made what seemed like innocent gifts to her sisters-in-law, specially embroidered purses that she presented to Margaret of Burgundy, Blanche of Burgundy, and Joan of Burgundy, the wives of her 3 brothers Louis, Charles, and Philip respectively. The discovery of the adultery came about through Isabella's sharp eye for detail and her understanding of courtly protocol. When she returned to England and hosted a grand dinner to celebrate her visit to France, Isabella noticed something that immediately aroused her suspicions. 2 Norman knights, brothers named Goder and Philippe d'Aunay, were wearing at their belts the exact same embroidered purses she had given to her sisters-in-law. In the hierarchical world of medieval court culture, such intimate gifts would only be shared between lovers, and Isabella quickly deduced that the knights must have been carrying on illicit affairs with the royal princesses. Isabella's decision to inform her father about her suspicions set in motion a chain of events that would destroy lives, undermine the stability of the French monarchy, and create the succession crisis that Jacques de Molay had predicted. Philip Romanfort ordered his agents to place the suspected knights and princesses under careful surveillance. An investigation that followed revealed a pattern of adultery and deception that shocked even the cynical French court. The affairs had been conducted primarily in the Tour de Nesle, an old guard tower in Paris that Philip had purchased in 1308 and that provided a discreet location for clandestine meetings. The evidence gathered by Philip's investigators painted a picture of systematic adultery that went far beyond casual infidelity. Margaret of Burgundy and Blanche of Burgundy had been meeting regularly with the D'Aunay brothers for drinking, feasting, and sexual encounters that violated both their marriage vows and their obligations to the royal family. Joan of Burgundy was initially accused only of knowing about the affairs and failing to report them, but the investigation eventually extended to include charges that she too had been engaging in adultery. The scandal was more than just a personal embarrassment for the royal family. It created serious questions about the legitimacy of potential heirs and the moral authority of the monarchy itself. In medieval political theory, the king's authority derived partly from divine approval, and sexual misconduct within the royal family suggested that God's favor had been withdrawn from the dynasty. The timing of the scandal, coming so soon after the destruction of the Templars and Malé's curse, convinced many observers that it was a sign of supernatural judgment against the Capetian line. Philip Romanfort's response to the scandal was characteristically brutal and demonstrated his awareness that far more than personal honor was at stake. The 2 D'Aunay brothers were arrested, subjected to torture to extract detailed confessions about their relationships with the princesses, and then executed in a gruesome public spectacle that was designed to demonstrate royal justice while also serving as a warning to anyone else who might be tempted to compromise the royal bloodline. The brothers were flayed alive and then beheaded, a punishment so severe that it suggested Philip's understanding that the stability of his entire dynasty was under threat. The fate of the 3 princesses was equally harsh and had lasting consequences for the succession. Margaret of Burgundy was imprisoned in the fortress of Château-Gaillard, where she was kept in solitary confinement under conditions so harsh that she died under mysterious circumstances in 1315, possibly murdered or driven to suicide by the hopelessness of her situation. Blanche of Burgundy was also imprisoned at Château-Gaillard but survived her captivity, though she was never allowed to return to court or resume her role as a royal princess. Joan of Burgundy, whose involvement in the scandal was considered less serious, was eventually pardoned and allowed to return to her husband, but the damage to her reputation and to the stability of the royal marriage had already been done. The Tour de Nesle affair created immediate practical problems for the royal succession that would plague the Capetian dynasty for the rest of its existence. The legitimacy of potential heirs was now in question, as it was unclear which children had been fathered by the royal princes and which might have been the result of their wives' adulterous relationships. This uncertainty about bloodlines was particularly dangerous in a system where royal authority depended on the concept of divinely ordained inheritance through legitimate royal blood. The Crusades shook Europe as the flames began to lick at the base of the carefully constructed pyre. Jacques de Molay summoned his remaining strength and raised his voice to address the crowd that had gathered to witness his death. His words, spoken with startling clarity despite the smoke and heat beginning to surround him, would echo through the centuries and become one of the most famous and powerful curses in European history. The exact wording of Molay's final statement varies in different historical accounts, reflecting the fact that different observers focused on different aspects of his remarkable final declaration. But the essential message was unmistakable. He was calling down divine judgment upon those who had destroyed his order through lies, torture, and political manipulation. Pope Clement, King Philip, within a year, I summon you both to appear before the tribunal of God. Molay's voice carried across the water and reached not only the assembled crowd, but also observers watching from windows and rooftops throughout the surrounding area. Some accounts suggest that he was even more specific in his predictions, declaring that Clement would die within 40 days and Philip would not live to see the end of the year. The Grand Master also extended his prophetic curse to Philip's descendants, proclaiming that the royal line would be extinguished and that France itself would suffer for the terrible injustice that had been committed against his order. The power and authority of Molay's words came not just from their content, but from the extraordinary circumstances under which they were spoken. Here was a man who was facing one of the most agonizing deaths imaginable, yet he showed no fear of his tormentors, no desire to curry favor with them, and no inclination to beg for mercy that would not be granted. Instead, he used his final moments on earth to proclaim his order's innocence and to call for divine justice against those who had wronged them. The courage and absolute conviction with which he spoke gave his words a weight and spiritual authority that impressed even his enemies and left many observers convinced that they were witnessing something far more significant than an ordinary execution. But Molay's curse was not motivated by personal revenge or bitterness at his own fate. Throughout his final statement, delivered as the flames crept higher around his body, the Grand Master emphasized the innocence of his order and the magnitude of the injustice that had been committed against it. He was not cursing Philip and Clement because they had imprisoned and tortured him personally, though he had certainly suffered terribly at their hands. Rather, he was appealing to the highest court of all, the judgment seat of God himself, for justice against those who had destroyed the holy order through deliberate lies and fabricated accusations. The theological implications of Molay's curse were profound and would have been clearly understood by his medieval audience. In medieval Christian belief, the prayers and curses of dying martyrs carried special power with God and were believed to be heard and answered with particular favor. A man who was about to face his Creator was thought to be in a state of particular grace, freed from earthly concerns and able to speak truth with unusual clarity and authority. By maintaining his innocence to the very end and calling for divine justice rather than earthly revenge, Molay was positioning himself as a martyr for truth rather than a penitent heretic, and his audience understood the implications of this distinction. Geoffrey de Charny, bound to his own stake beside his Grand Master, added his voice to Molay's curse with equal courage and conviction. The former preceptor of Normandy, a man who had spent his life in military service and understood the realities of combat and death better than most, declared that their order was innocent of all charges and that God would vindicate them even as their enemies celebrated their destruction. Together, these two old men faced their horrible deaths with a dignity and spiritual strength that provided the most powerful possible testimony to the principles they had served throughout their lives. The reaction of the crowd to Molay's curse was immediate, visceral, and unforgettable. A murmur of fear, amazement, and recognition swept through the assembled spectators as they realized they were witnessing something far more significant than a routine execution of convicted heretics. The Grand Master's words had carried the unmistakable authority of a man who was about to face divine judgment himself, and even those who had believed in his guilt were shaken by the absolute conviction with which he proclaimed his innocence and called down God's wrath upon his persecutors. Many in the crowd began to cross themselves and mutter prayers, recognizing that they were witnessing either the final defiance of dangerous heretics or the martyrdom of innocent men who had been destroyed by political manipulation. The distinction mattered enormously, because if the Templars were truly innocent, then everyone present was complicit in witnessing a great injustice, and the curse that Molay had pronounced might well extend to all who had supported or allowed the destruction of his order. The flames consumed the two Templars slowly and with deliberate cruelty, but contemporary accounts report that both men maintained their composure and continued to proclaim their innocence and their faith even as their bodies were systematically destroyed by the fire. Their extraordinary courage in the face of such an agonizing death provided the most powerful possible evidence that they genuinely believed in the truth of what they were saying. Men who were guilty of the crimes they had been accused of would almost certainly have chosen to confess and seek mercy rather than endure such horrible suffering while maintaining their innocence. As the flames grew higher and the smoke thicker, witnesses reported that Molay continued to speak, repeating his proclamation of innocence and his call for divine justice until the fire finally claimed his life. His final words, delivered with his last breath, were said to be a renewed declaration that the Knights Templar had been pure and holy, and that those who had destroyed them would face God's judgment. These words, spoken by a dying man in his final moments, carried the power and authority that would resonate through the centuries and inspire countless others who faced similar struggles against injustice and oppression. The swift hand of divine justice. The supernatural power of Jack de Mauley's curse became apparent with shocking speed that amazed contemporaries throughout Europe and has continued to fascinate historians and students of the cult for more than 7 centuries. Pope Clement V, the man who had betrayed his sacred duty to protect the Templars and had allowed an innocent religious order to be destroyed for the sake of political convenience, fell gravely ill almost immediately after Mauley's execution with symptoms that his medieval physicians found both baffling and terrifying. The Pope, who had discovered the truth about the Templars' innocence through his own careful investigation but had lacked the courage to act on that knowledge, began to suffer from terrible abdominal pains that modern medical experts believe may have been caused by bowel cancer, stomach cancer, or some other form of rapidly spreading internal malignancy. What made Clement's illness particularly ominous to contemporary observers was not just its severity, but the speed with which it progressed and the timing of its onset. Clement's decline was both rapid and agonizing, with symptoms that seemed to defy all of the medical knowledge and treatment methods available in the early 14th century. The Pope, who had been in reasonably good health despite his advanced age and the considerable stress of managing the papal court during one of its most difficult periods, suddenly began experiencing excruciating pain that could not be relieved by any of the herbal remedies, bloodletting procedures, or other treatments that medieval physicians employed. His appetite disappeared completely, he lost weight dramatically, and he began to suffer from severe digestive problems that left him weak and barely able to fulfill his papal duties. The speed and severity of Clement's decline convinced many observers that something supernatural was at work. The Pope's personal physicians, who had successfully treated various ailments and injuries throughout his papacy, found themselves completely unable to understand or treat his new condition. Their failure to provide relief or even to offer a credible explanation for what was happening to their patient added to the growing belief among both clergy and lay people that Mauley's curse was genuinely taking effect. Word of the Pope's mysterious and apparently incurable illness spread rapidly throughout Christian Europe, carried by the extensive networks of clergy, merchants, pilgrims, and diplomatic messengers who connected medieval kingdoms. The story grew and became more dramatic with each telling, but the basic facts remained consistent. The Pope, who had allowed the Templars to be destroyed, was dying in agony, and his suffering had begun almost immediately after Jacques de Mauley's execution. Clement's psychological state during his final weeks was particularly revealing and added credibility to reports that he was being consumed by guilt over his role in the Templars' destruction. According to several reliable accounts from members of the papal court, the Pope became increasingly agitated and fearful as his physical condition worsened. He was reported to have spoken frequently about the Templars, often in terms that suggested deep regret about his decisions regarding their fate. Some sources indicate that he attempted to issue pardons for surviving Templars or to reverse some of his earlier decisions regarding the order, but his physical weakness and the opposition of his advisors prevented any meaningful action. On April 20, 1314, just 33 days after Jacques de Mauley's execution, and well within the 40-day time frame that some sources attribute to the Grand Master's specific prediction, Pope Clement V died in terrible agony at his residence in Rocamora, near Avignon. The precise timing of his death seemed to confirm the supernatural power of Mauley's final words and convinced many people throughout Europe that they had witnessed genuine divine intervention. The circumstances surrounding Clement's death became even more dramatic and supernatural in character due to events that occurred after his demise. According to widely reported accounts that appeared in chronicles throughout Europe, while Clement's body was lying in state in the church at Rocquemore, a violent thunderstorm arose during the night. Lightning struck the church building, setting it on fire with such intensity that the blaze could not be brought under control before it had consumed much of the structure. When the fire was finally extinguished, witnesses discovered that the Pope's body had been almost completely destroyed, reduced to little more than ash and charred fragments. This destruction of Clement's corpse was interpreted by medieval observers as unmistakable evidence of divine judgment. In medieval Christian belief, the preservation of the bodies of holy men after death was considered a sign of divine favor and potential sainthood. Conversely, the destruction or corruption of corpses was often interpreted as evidence that God had rejected the deceased and condemned their souls. The fact that Clement's body had been consumed by what appeared to be supernatural fire convinced many people that Jacques de Mauley's curse had been validated by divine intervention and that the Pope's soul had been condemned for his betrayal of innocent men. But Clement's horrific death was only the beginning of the fulfillment of Mauley's prophetic curse. King Philip Roman IV, the primary architect of the Templars' destruction and the man who had profited most directly from their downfall, began to experience his own mysterious and alarming decline in health during the summer and fall of 1314. The king, who had seemed invincible in his political maneuvering, who had successfully challenged both papal authority and the power of international religious orders, who had accumulated wealth and territory through ruthless efficiency, found himself increasingly weak and unable to enjoy the fruits of his many victories. Philip's decline was particularly mysterious and ominous because he had been famous throughout his reign for his excellent health and physical vigor. The king was known throughout Europe for his love of hunting, an extremely demanding physical activity that required considerable stamina, strength, and coordination. He had survived numerous political crises, military campaigns, and diplomatic challenges without showing any signs of physical weakness or health problems. But during the months following Mauley's execution, Philip began to suffer from a variety of ailments that his physicians could neither explain nor treat effectively. The king's symptoms included severe and persistent headaches, difficulty concentrating on matters of state, and episodes of what appeared to have been neurological problems that affected his ability to speak clearly and think coherently. He began to have trouble with his memory, often forgetting important details about ongoing political and administrative matters. His physical coordination deteriorated noticeably, and he began to have difficulty riding horses or engaging in the hunting and other physical activities that he had always enjoyed and that had been central to his identity as a medieval king. Like Pope Clement, Philip seemed to be experiencing a decline that was too rapid and too severe to be explained by natural causes alone. His physicians, who had successfully treated various injuries and illnesses throughout his long reign, found themselves as baffled by his condition as Clement's doctors had been. The failure of medical treatment, combined with the timing of his illness and its similarity to the Pope's mysterious decline, convinced many observers that supernatural forces were at work. On November 29, 1314, just 8 months after Jacques de Mauley's execution, and well within the 1-year time frame that the Grand Master had specified in his curse, King Philip Roman IV died suddenly at the age of 46 while hunting in a forest of Pont Saint-Maxence. According to the official account, the king suffered a stroke or similar neurological catastrophe that caused him to fall from his horse and die almost immediately. But the timing and circumstances of his death seemed so perfectly aligned with Mauley's prophecy that very few people, even among Philip's supporters, believed it was merely a coincidence. The death of both Pope Clement and King Philip within the specific time frames mentioned in Jacques de Mauley's curse sent shockwaves of fear and amazement throughout Europe. The speed and apparently supernatural nature of these deaths convinced vast numbers of people, from peasants to nobles to high-ranking clergy, that the Templars had indeed been innocent and that divine justice had intervened to punish their persecutors. Even in distant parts of Europe that had not been directly involved in the Templar trials, Philip's death was spoken of as divine retribution for his destruction of the order, and Clement was described as having shed tears of remorse on his deathbed for his role in allowing the suppression of innocent men. The systematic extinction of the Capetian line, but Jacques de Mauley's curse was far from finished with the dramatic deaths of Pope Clement and King Philip. The Grand Master had specifically and explicitly cursed Philip's descendants, predicting that the royal line would not endure and that the Capetian dynasty would be extinguished as punishment for the injustice committed against the Templars. This aspect of the curse would prove even more dramatically accurate than the immediate deaths of the Templars' primary persecutors, unfolding over the next 14 years in a series of events so extraordinary and systematic that they seem to confirm beyond any doubt the supernatural power of the dying Grand Master's final words. Philip Roman IV had appeared to ensure the continuation of his dynasty through careful dynastic planning that should have guaranteed the survival of his bloodline for many generations. The king had 3 adult sons, Louis, Philip, and Charles, all of whom were married to women from powerful noble families and appeared to be in excellent health. The succession seemed completely secure, with multiple male heirs available to continue the Capetian line that had ruled France continuously since Hugh Capet's accession to the throne in 987. But the curse of Jacques de Molay would systematically and remorselessly destroy this carefully constructed dynastic stability in ways that no one could have predicted or prevented. Louis X, known as the Irritable or the Quarrelsome, succeeded his father as king in 1314, but his reign was troubled from the very beginning by the consequences of the Tour de Nesle affair and what appeared to be the continuing effects of Molay's supernatural curse. The new king was described by contemporary chroniclers as weak, easily influenced by court favourites and sycophants, and generally unpleasant and unintelligent. His personality and capabilities stood in stark contrast to those of his formidable father, suggesting to many observers that the royal bloodline was already showing signs of the degeneration that Molay had predicted. Louis's most serious problem was the succession crisis created by his wife Margaret's imprisonment for adultery in the Tour de Nesle affair. Margaret remained confined in the fortress of Chateau Gaillard throughout Louis's reign, creating a complex legal and dynastic situation since their daughter Joan's legitimacy was now questionable and they had no son to continue the royal line. The uncertainty about royal bloodlines was particularly dangerous in a system where royal authority depended fundamentally on the concept of legitimate inheritance through divinely ordained royal blood. Louis attempted to resolve this critical succession problem by having his marriage to Margaret annulled on grounds of adultery and then marrying Clemens of Hungary in the desperate hope of producing a legitimate male heir. This solution seemed politically sound and dynastically necessary, but fate appeared to be working systematically against the Capetian dynasty. Louis died suddenly and unexpectedly in 1316, just 2 years after becoming king and before his new wife could give birth to a child that might have secured the succession. The tragedy of Louis X's reign became even more pronounced when Clemens of Hungary did give birth to a son, who was proclaimed King John I of France. For a brief moment, it appeared that the Capetian line might continue despite the setbacks of the previous years. But the infant king lived for only 5 days before dying under mysterious circumstances that his physicians could not explain. The death of John I was particularly ominous to contemporary observers because it suggested that Molay's curse was affecting even newborn members of the royal family, systematically eliminating all potential male heirs to ensure the complete extinction of Philip Roman IV's bloodline. Philip V, known as the Tall, succeeded his brother Louis and his infant nephew John in 1316, but his reign was also marked by the continuing and seemingly inexorable effects of what people throughout Europe were beginning to call the Templar curse. Although Philip V was generally considered more competent than his predecessor and managed to achieve significant improvements in the kingdom's finances and administration, he too struggled with the fundamental problem that was plaguing his entire family, the inability to produce a male heir to continue the dynasty. Despite being married to Joan of Burgundy, who had been cleared of the most serious charges in the Tour de Nesle affair and was considered to be in good health, Philip V was unable to father a son. The royal couple had several daughters, which proved their fertility and suggested that there were no obvious medical reasons for their failure to produce male heirs. Yet year after year passed without the birth of a prince, and observers began to whisper that supernatural forces were preventing the continuation of the Capetian line. Philip V reigned for 6 years, from 1316 to 1322, during which time he demonstrated considerable ability as an administrator and military leader. He reformed the French legal system, improved the kingdom's financial situation, and generally provided competent governance during a difficult period. But none of his achievements could solve the basic problem of the succession. Despite having several daughters who proved his ability to father children, Philip V died in 1322 without leaving a son to continue the direct Capetian line. The pattern that had begun with Louis X was continuing with devastating and seemingly supernatural consistency. Charles Roman IV, known as the Fair, was the last of Philip Roman IV's sons to rule France, and his reign represented the final act in a drama of Capetian extinction that Jacques de Molay had predicted. Like his brothers, Charles appeared to be in good health and was married to women who should have been able to bear children, but he too failed utterly to produce a male heir despite increasingly desperate efforts to ensure the continuation of his father's bloodline. Charles reigned for 6 years, from 1322 to 1328, during which time he married 3 times in succession in increasingly frantic attempts to produce the son that the kingdom desperately needed. His first wife was Blanche of Burgundy, the same woman who had been imprisoned for adultery in the Tour de Nesle affair. After she was declared to have been less culpable than initially believed, Charles married her in an attempt to legitimize their previous relationship and produce an heir. But Blanche proved unable to bear children, and the marriage was eventually annulled. Charles then married Marie of Luxembourg, who also failed to produce a male heir and died young under circumstances that added to the growing belief throughout Europe that the French royal family was under supernatural judgment. His third and final marriage, to Joan of Arc, was his last desperate attempt to ensure the survival of his dynasty. This marriage did produce children, raising hope that the curse might finally be broken, but they were all daughters. Charles died in 1328 without ever achieving his goal of producing a son to continue the Capetian line. When Charles Roman IV died in 1328, the direct line of the Capetian dynasty came to an end exactly as Jacques de Molay had predicted 14 years earlier. 14 years after the Grand Master's execution, despite the efforts of 3 different kings and their multiple marriages, not one of Philip Roman IV's 3 sons had managed to produce a surviving male heir. The throne passed to Philip VI of Valois, a cousin from a collateral branch of the royal family, marking the definitive end of the dynasty that had ruled France for over 3 centuries and creating the succession crisis that would ultimately lead to the devastating 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War occurs as catastrophic legacy. The extinction of the direct Capetian line had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate fulfillment of Jacques de Molay's curse and would fundamentally reshape the political, social, and cultural landscape of Western Europe for generations. The succession crisis created by the systematic failure of Philip Roman IV's sons to produce male heirs opened the door to competing claims to the French throne, ultimately leading to the catastrophic conflict known as the 100 Years' War that would devastate both France and England for more than a century. Edward Roman III of England, whose mother Isabella was the daughter of Philip Roman IV and sister to the 3 kings who had failed to produce heirs, claimed that he had a superior right to the French throne compared to Philip VI of Valois. According to Edward's legal argument, the throne should pass through the female line to Philip Roman IV's grandson rather than to his nephew from a collateral branch of the family. Under normal circumstances, this claim might have seemed far-fetched and politically motivated, as French tradition generally favored male inheritance and was deeply suspicious of foreign rulers. But the extraordinary circumstances surrounding the extinction of the Capetian line, combined with a widespread belief that the royal family was under supernatural judgment, gave Edward's claim a credibility and legitimacy it would not otherwise have possessed. The legal and theoretical arguments surrounding the succession were extraordinarily complex and involved fundamental questions about the nature of royal authority, the rules of inheritance, and the relationship between divine favor and political legitimacy. French supporters of Philip VI argued that Salic law, which prohibited inheritance through the female line, prevented Edward Roman III from claiming the throne through his mother Isabella. But Edward's supporters pointed out that Salic law had never been definitively established as the fundamental law of France and that the systematic failure of Philip Roman IV's sons to produce heirs suggested divine disapproval of the Valois succession. The war that resulted from this succession dispute would last for more than a century, from 1337 to 1453, and would fundamentally alter the political, social, military, and cultural landscape of Western Europe. The conflict would encompass some of the most famous battles in medieval history, including Crusades 1346, Poitiers 1356, and Agincourt 1415, where French chivalry would be systematically crushed by English longbowmen and new military technologies that revolutionized the nature of medieval warfare. The war would produce legendary figures like the Black Prince and Joan of Arc, would lead to the development of new concepts of national identity and sovereignty, and would accelerate the transition from medieval to early modern political and social structures. The economic and social disruption caused by the 100 Years' War was enormous and affected virtually every aspect of life in both France and England. France, which had been the most powerful, prosperous, and culturally influential kingdom in Europe under Philip Roman IV, was reduced to a devastated battleground where competing armies fought for control of towns, countryside and the loyalty of the population. The French population declined dramatically due to warfare, disease, famine, and the general breakdown of social and economic structures. The French monarchy was repeatedly humiliated by English victories that seemed to confirm the continuing effects of the Templar curse on the royal family and the kingdom as a whole. The psychological and cultural impact of these disasters on the French people was perhaps even more significant than the material damage caused by decades of warfare. The extraordinary accuracy of Jacques de Malé's curse, combined with the catastrophic military defeats that followed the extinction of the Capetian dynasty, convinced many French people that their kingdom was being punished for the terrible injustice that had been committed against the Templars. Philip Roman IV's descendants became known throughout Europe as the Accursed Kings, a title that reflected the widespread belief that the royal family was under divine judgment and that France itself was suffering for the sins of its rulers. The enduring legend and cultural impact. The story of Jacques de Malé's curse became one of the most powerful and enduring legends in European history, inspiring countless works of literature, art, historical writing, and popular culture that continued to resonate with audiences centuries after the events themselves. The image of the old Grand Master calling down divine judgment on his persecutors as the flames consumed his body captured the imagination of people across Europe and provided a compelling symbol of resistance to tyranny, injustice, and the abuse of power. The curse became a potent reminder that even the most powerful rulers were ultimately subject to divine justice and that truth and righteousness would eventually prevail, even when human institutions failed completely. The accuracy of Malé's predictions gave the story a credibility and power that many medieval legends and folktales lacked. The deaths of Pope Clement and King Philip within the specified timeframes, followed by the systematic extinction of the Capetian dynasty exactly as predicted, provided concrete evidence that seemed to confirm the supernatural power of the Grand Master's final words. Even skeptics and those who were generally dismissive of supernatural claims found it difficult to explain away the series of coincidences as mere chance, particularly when the consequences of the curse continued to unfold over decades and ultimately reshaped the political map of Europe. The legend of the curse also served important political, social, and psychological functions in medieval and early modern European society. It provided a comprehensive narrative framework for understanding the disasters that befell France in the 14th and 15th centuries, offering an explanation for events that might otherwise have seemed random, incomprehensible, or attributable only to bad luck or poor leadership. The curse also served as a powerful warning to rulers throughout Europe about the dangers of systematic injustice and the abuse of power, suggesting that even kings and popes were subject to divine judgment and that crimes against innocent people would ultimately be punished. Writers, chroniclers, and historians found the story irresistible, and accounts of the curse appeared in virtually every type of literature throughout the medieval and early modern periods. The story was particularly popular during times of political crisis and social upheaval, when people were looking for explanations for the disasters that seemed to afflict their rulers and their societies. The curse provided a morally satisfying explanation for political upheaval and social catastrophe, suggesting that ultimate justice would prevail even when human institutions proved corrupt, incompetent, or evil. The romantic and heroic appeal of the Templars as warrior monks who had been unjustly persecuted added immeasurably to the power and popularity of the legend. The Order's association with the Crusades, the Holy Land, and various mysteries and secrets made them natural subjects for romantic literature and popular fascination. The image of Jacques de Molay as a martyred hero who had died defending his order's honor resonated powerfully with audiences who admired courage in the face of overwhelming odds and who longed for examples of individuals who would sacrifice everything for their principles. The story of the Templar curse also became intertwined with various conspiracy theories and esoteric traditions that developed in later centuries. Claims of connections between surviving Templars and the development of Freemasonry, while largely unsupported by historical evidence, added another layer of mystery and intrigue to the legend. These speculative connections, while historically questionable, demonstrated the continuing power of the Templar story to inspire theories about hidden knowledge, secret societies, and the survival of ancient wisdom. Modern historical vindication and the lessons for humanity. The gradual rehabilitation of the Templars' reputation over the centuries has provided a different kind of vindication for Jacques de Molay's final proclamation of innocence. Modern historical scholarship has conclusively established that the charges against the Templars were fabricated and that their confessions were extracted through torture. The discovery of the chin on parchment in 2001 provided documentary proof that Pope Clement V's own investigation had found the Templars innocent of the heresy charges that were used to justify the destruction. This documentary evidence confirmed what historians had long suspected based on the patterns of confession and recantation that characterized the trials. The geographical variation in confession rates, with Templars confessing to heresy in countries where torture was routinely used but maintaining their innocence in countries where torture was illegal, provided compelling evidence that the confessions were coerced. The uniformity of the French confessions, compared to the diversity of testimony from English and other Templars, further supported the conclusion that the French proceedings were systematically manipulated. The political and financial motivations for the destruction of the order are now clearly understood by historians. Philip Romanfort's desperate need for money, combined with his enormous debt to the Templars, provided obvious motives for destroying the order and seizing its assets. Guillaume de Nogaret's role in fabricating charges and manipulating legal proceedings has been thoroughly documented. The weakness of Pope Clement V and his dependence on French political support explain his failure to protect an order that his own investigation had found innocent. This historical vindication has transformed Jacques de Molay from a convicted heretic into a martyr for truth and justice. The Grand Master's final recantation and his willingness to die rather than accept false charges against his order are now seen as acts of extraordinary courage rather than the stubborn defiance of a guilty man. His curse is understood not as supernatural revenge but as a prophetic insight into the inevitable consequences of systematic injustice. The eternal lesson of human courage. The story of Jacques de Molay and the destruction of the Knights Templar offers timeless lessons about the nature of power, justice, and human courage that remain as relevant today as they were 7 centuries ago. But beyond the grand political machinations and supernatural curses, this story is fundamentally about ordinary human beings caught in extraordinary circumstances, forced to make impossible choices between survival and principle, between safety and truth. The hundreds of Templars who suffered in Philip's dungeons were not legendary warriors or mystical guardians of ancient secrets. They were men who had devoted their lives to what they believed was a holy cause, who found themselves branded as heretics and criminals through no fault of their own. Some broke under torture and confessed to crimes they had never committed. Others found the strength to maintain their innocence even when it meant certain death. All of them faced unimaginable suffering with whatever courage they could muster. Their courage in enduring unendurable conditions, their determination to protect their brothers despite impossible odds, and their ability to find moments of connection and humanity in the midst of systematic torture and dehumanization testify to the strength of the human spirit and remind us of our shared humanity. So the next time you encounter the story of the Knights Templar, whether in history books or popular culture, remember the untold hundreds who lived and died not as legendary crusaders or keepers of mystical secrets, but as ordinary men whose lives were shaped by suffering but who remained fundamentally human despite the system's attempts to dehumanize them through torture, false accusations, and judicial murder. Their stories matter because they remind us that history is not just about great events and famous people, but about the daily experiences of ordinary people who chose courage over comfort, truth over safety, and principle over survival. They deserve to be remembered, honored, and never forgotten. Remember them because in remembering them, we honor the best of our own humanity and commit ourselves to building a world where no one will have to endure what they endured just to survive, where justice cannot be bought and sold, and where truth cannot be tortured into submission. Outro music begins to fade in. Thank you for joining us on this dark journey through medieval castle life. Until next time, this has been another episode of Lazy History, where we uncover the truths that textbooks prefer to forget.